And the nice thing is that gives me a perspective on how the industry is moving in a way that a lot of times appraisers in the field don't have. But I think that, appraisers in the field are really sort of the, front lines of, they're the dynamic process that makes things go. And so, although Scott is a little bit like me, he has a very big shop. And so it probably doesn't do a huge amount of appraising anymore. His perspective locally in there, Atlanta, is great. So he's going to take the last hour to talk a little bit about, all the intricacies of, time adjustments and things that are moving the market, which I might not have that much perspective on. So my first slide here is, I always start everything with basically two questions. I learned this some years ago because real estate is that weird space where, you can't force somebody to buy or sell real estate. And so negotiation is sort of the name of the game, and being good at that ultimately really propels you and your brand. And so I recall many years ago, someone having a conversation with me about, the different elements of negotiating, never go first, things like that. But they sort of boiled it down into sort of, before you engage in any negotiation, you should always ask yourself two questions. What are you hoping to get out of this, right? And why does that matter to you? And although this is a class and not a negotiation, I do think that that's pretty much the two questions you should ask yourself before you do anything. And therefore, what are you hoping to get out of this class? And why does that matter to you? So anybody want to share sort of those two things for them personally? What are they hoping to get out of this class and why does it matter? You can hit your space bar and share your thoughts. Don't be bashful. Somebody's got to break the ice.
This is Mary. I'm hoping to learn what I should send to the appraiser in terms of comps, etc., before the appraisal.
And why does that matter to you?
I want to make sure it appraises properly.
Good appraisal outcome, right? Anybody else want to share what they're hoping to get out of the class and why that's important to them? I see Maple, some people are asking questions, so maybe they feel more comfortable typing it.
Yes.
Hi, this is Jessica.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to get a better understanding, what all goes into an appraisal. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've, a lot of times you just have no idea why it's so far off the mark. And even when I first started, I had one, the buyer hadn't selected a lender and they had two appraisals. They were 30 grand apart, the same week. And so just trying to figure out how to best explain to my clients, what could happen.
And why does that matter to you?
It matters to me so that I can educate my buyers, the sellers, but mostly the buyers, so that they know what an appraiser is going to look at and, what potentially could come in low.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I sort of, normally when I think about the appraisal process, I'm always sort of thinking a little bit about the listing agent, because I think it sort of starts there, right? The listing agent is the one who's going to advise the seller on the price and how to compete in a marketplace, right? So I always see the listing agent having this very powerful role about setting price, staging, and thinking about, how they want to engage and interact with the marketplace. The marketplace today is super hot, super in favor of sellers, but that's not always the case. And listing agents have to be super sophisticated around, getting all those things right. Because in a perfect world, right, the listing price should work for you. So if you get that right, it's like a virtuous process. Everything else goes right after it. Get that wrong, and it's like that starts all your problems. If you price too high, obviously, right, you've got a lot of problems. The house might not sell. If you price too low, you leave money on the table. So you might sell the asset, and I see that in today's world a lot, where there was a property just recently that went for $1 million over list price. And you think, wow, that's really great. I was expecting to get this price and I got $1 million more. Now I'm so happy. Well, unfortunately, maybe you should be happy and maybe you shouldn't, because if you set the price wrong, how do you even know? And I have seen transactions where it looks like a house, you sell it like a house, but it's not a house. It's actually an apartment complex to be developed. So this is the concept of highest and best use. So when you're actually setting the price, you've really got to start with, what are you selling? And sometimes agents get that wrong. And if they get that wrong, obviously everything else is going to be wrong. And this results in unhappy sellers, because just like if you set the list price at 500, but the house is worth 750, you might sell it for more than the 500. You might sell it for 600. Now everybody's happy because they got 600 when they thought 500 was the number. But what you really left on the table is the 750. And that is a big challenge, and especially a big challenge in today's market, because it's really hard to know where things are and should be priced. And so I think that, if you are not super comfortable in that space, i.e. you really know that marketplace, you should probably partner with somebody who does, right? Appraisers often do something called a pre-listing appraisal. And a pre-listing appraisal will help you if you feel like you're a little out of your depth in getting it right. And probably the biggest thing that they can bring to the table is the ability to understand highest and best use and the movement of something. Right now, we have a lot of jurisdictions around the country that are outlawing single-family zoning, which seems so strange, right? So you have neighborhoods and they all have single-family zonings, which means they're all going to be houses. But affordability is such a huge problem nationally that a lot of municipalities have said, let's encourage higher development by getting rid of the single-family zone. And so in certain places in LA where they've done this, or in Seattle where they've done this, or Oregon, you think you're living in a single family house, but it really actually is now 20 apartments. And so when you sell that property, you have to know that the person who's going to buy it's going to tear it down and put up 20 apartments, or 30 or 40 or 50 apartments, whatever. And so from that standpoint, it's worth something more than what you see physically sitting on the property. And you may not know that if you don't keep up with it. And so if you're taking a listing in a place where you've never been before, just know that there's a lot more to it than just what's sitting on the site or where things are going. What the last house is sold for might at this point be relatively not that important. I mean, we see a number of places seeing 15, 20% appreciation. And so you're talking about 1% to 2% a month. So if something sold a year ago, it might not be that relevant in today's marketplace. So just keep that in mind. Anybody else see something totally radically different than those things of what they're hoping to get out of this class and why it matters?
We definitely had some questions about what to say or what not to say to appraisers. That seems to be a thread, and I know that we're going to extensively cover that during this course.
Yep.
And then also about the appreciation is another one coming up.
Sure. Okay, well, good. Let's jump into it then.
Will this be a good time now for me to go ahead and take the screen and do the sign in?
Yeah, it looks like we've got 112 people who are currently on, so that it feels like we're fairly stable at that number, and we're 20 minutes into it. So if you haven't showed up to your Zoom call after 20 minutes, that's probably an indication that you aren't planning to attend.
All right, so on your screen right now, and I'm going to also post it into the chat, or Kate, can you go ahead and post that link in the chat for me, please? So on the screen, the easiest way to sign in is going to be hold your cell phone up to the computer and let the QR code do its job. So open your phone app and it's going to open to a website. And the top line, you're going to go ahead and put your name in as it appears on your license. The next one is going to ask for the course code. This is your sign in course code. And that one is today's date, 041921, and then the letters HN. The next thing it's going to ask for is your license number. That'll be your 6-digit license number. If you're a licensed real estate agent or broker, go ahead and put that in. If you're not, leave it blank. This course also qualifies for CE for appraisers. So if you're an appraiser, go ahead and put your appraisal number in. It doesn't matter what level it is, whether you're registered, certified, licensed, just put the number in. And then you're going to go ahead and put your email in. You're going to press next and then press submit. This form is going to go ahead and refresh as it go very back to the beginning. That means that you have done this correctly. Once it goes back and refreshes, it is ready for the next person. If you were sitting with multiple people, you could hand your device over to the next person. They can put their information in. If you get red letters, don't worry about it. If you get an error, I still received your information. If I have any issues, I will reach out to you personally. So you can either use your phone and use the QR code on your screen, or in the chat, Kate just posted the link for you. So if that's easier for you, you can use the link. And the other thing that we're going to do as far as housekeeping. So if you are here for CE, the other requirement is that you must have your video on. And I will be pulling a list of all the sign-ins shortly, and I will be correlating this with everybody's video to make sure. We have so many people here in the class today that if your video is not on and you did not sign in, I am not going to bother you, because I know quite a few people said, hey, I'm just listening today. I'm here for knowledge. You might have multiple things going on. That is okay. You don't have to have your video on if you're not here for CE. But if you're here for CE, that video must be on. And if I see your name, you're here for video, and you also registered that you are here for CE, I will be asking you to turn your video on. The other third point is your name in Zoom. So when we pull our auditing report, your name in Zoom is going to be what shows that you are here for the class for the duration. So if you hover your mouse over your little video feed, in the upper right-hand corner, you have 3 little dots. In there, you'll have an option to rename. So let's say, for example, your name came up with something that doesn't match your name, or it came up with, sometimes it's called iPad or Samsung, or something else shows up for your Zoom name. You can change that. Or the other option is just go into chat and message myself, Maple, and I will change your name for you. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to Brian at this time. And if you have any questions, just message me in the chat and I will help you out.
I am confused. I don't know how to do it.
I will help you, Dee Dee.
Thank you, Maple. Very clear, helpful. Let me share my screen again. And that was a nice little break. I looked through the questions in the chat while I had my screen down. I think we, for the most part, got a pretty good sense of what people are looking for out of the course. It's interesting to see that there are a number of appraisers taking this for CE. How many appraisers do we have here? Raise your chat or hit your hand, raise your hand. Anybody? Anybody? So not so many appraisers taking this class. Okay, good. Speaking to the audience is always a little hard sometimes if you're not real familiar with what everybody's got going. Oh, there's a number of appraisers here. Okay, good. I always think that people taking CE are relatively new to being agents in this space. So how many agents do we have here who've been doing it for 10 or more years? Raise your hands. Surely somebody must have been doing it for more than 10 years. There you go, Kathy. Excellent. How many people are 5 years or less? When I'm playing this game, there's a little reaction button at the bottom. If you hit that reaction button, it's like raise your hand. You can hit the little raise your hand, and then that, oh, there you go. See, I see a whole bunch of hands now. And so it feels a lot like the CE classes that we teach, in the sense that, 10 to 15% of the people have been doing it for more than 10 years. Looks like the bulk of the other people have been doing it for 5 or less years. And so I try to keep these things relatively general in nature, but then I get a lot of feedback from the folks who've been doing it for a long time. It's like, why didn't you go a little deeper on that topic? Why didn't you dig in? And I'll dig in as deep as you want to go. Scott and I have done this together now. He knows that I can go really nerd out on appraisal stuff if need be. But I try to restrain myself, because I don't want to go too deep into the weeds when people don't really want to hear it. And so from that standpoint, I'm going to let the questions lead the depth of where we go. The rest of the time, I kind of stay to my slides, which I can tell you, I'm sort of thinking that 75% of our audience is agents who are been doing this for 5 years or less, which will enjoy, more topics, but maybe not as in depth, if that makes sense. Okay, so we'll get back at it. Maple, I can see that the chat box is kind of going. Is that people just putting in their license numbers, or somebody got a big question there?
I got it. People are having trouble with sign-in, so I'm privately messaging everybody, but yeah, it should be okay. Okay,
thanks, Kate. So I think the first thing to understand about appraisals is kind of like where they go, who are the clients, things like that, just sort of the general housekeeping stuff. And it really gets down to, for the most part, lenders order appraisals. And because lender orders the appraisal and pay the appraisers, that makes them the client. And understanding who the client for an appraisal is super important, because appraisers are an independent lot by law, and they are really bound by confidentiality to discuss matters of the appraisal only to their client once the appraisal has been produced. And this always gets down to, what can I say to an appraiser? When can I talk to them? Can they talk to me? All these things that go into it. And so you should sort of think about appraisals being sort of two phases of the assignment. The first phase is sort of the data analysis phase, which is where they're actually putting the report together. That's where they're doing the inspection. They're looking to the sales and listings to identify them as comparable. It's sort of an open gathering process. However, there's the second phase of the process, which is when the report is turned in and completed. Once it's signed, sealed, and delivered, the appraiser is bound by its confidentiality rules to discuss that appraisal with no one other than the client. And the client is the lender for lending appraisals. In fact, required by law to have it be that way. You cannot, as a lender, you cannot use an appraisal ordered by anyone other than a lender. So if the homeowner orders an appraisal or the agent orders an appraisal or whatever, they become the client, but then that means that that appraisal cannot be used for lending purposes. And so that's it's important to understand the dynamics there, because a lot of times people get confused. They're like, well, the borrower paid for the appraiser. Why isn't the borrower the client? Well, the borrower pays the lender pays the appraiser, and you kind of follow the money there. Every lender is required to give a copy of the appraisal to the borrower before the deal is done. But that still doesn't make the borrower the client for the appraiser, right? It's on the top left-hand side of an appraisal, hopefully everybody's seen one, you're gonna see a little box in that window that says client, and it'll always have the lender's name in it for lending purposes. And that's who the appraiser should talk to. Now, once the borrower is given a copy of the appraisal, they can do with it whatever they want. And often they'll give it to the agent, or they give it to whoever. Sometimes they give it to the seller, which I have no idea why. And so that means those people now, because they have a copy of the report, they feel that they are entitled to ask questions about it. And they are, I guess, to the borrower, but not to the appraiser. The appraiser does not have to talk to them, right? Make sense? You should know that appraisers live in a number of different worlds, and they organize their firms in a lot of different ways. So you can have an individual appraiser working out of their basement or an office, which is not uncommon. You can have appraisers who are working for regional operations that have 5 to 10 appraisers together, almost like a doctor's partnership that's put together. And then you can have very large companies that are organized around appraisal management. They're appraisal management companies. These are organizations that essentially are in business to place appraisal orders, and they do so with individual appraisers. Those appraisers do not work for those appraisal management companies. And it's a little bit of a weird gig. And a lot of lenders, especially the bigger lenders, will use these appraisal management companies to essentially independently take care of sourcing their appraisal reports. Prosperity Home Mortgage, we don't really do it that way. We use a panel of local appraisers. I'm a big believer that having a local competent appraiser makes all the difference in the world to getting a great appraisal outcome. I find that the best appraisers don't generally work for half the fee, which appraisal management companies, right, they're for-profit entities. They take their margin out of the appraisal before they release the fee. And sometimes they take 50, 60% of that, which to me is a bit odd. But so know that, you know, a bunch of lenders do it in different ways. And you hear about all these horror stories like, you know, appraiser came from 100 miles away, they're getting paid $100, right? That's a lender working with an appraisal management company. That does not necessarily always produce the best results, right? You get what you pay for. And so, you know, at Prosperity, we're the mortgage company owned by a realty company, you know, the one you work for. And so from that standpoint, we use a panel of local appraisers. We pay them the full fee, right? We're trying to get the best appraisal outcome, and we feel that that sort of process encourages that. All lenders are required by law to review all the appraisals that they get. And so inside of every lender, there will be someone who looks at the appraisal to see if it's any good. However, although they're required to review the appraisal, there are no stipulations for the qualifications and credentials of the people who do that review. And so at Prosperity Home Mortgage, we have a very large team of people who are both underwriters and appraisers who review all the appraisals. And so we have these, you know, high skill set individuals taking a look at appraisals because that's a part of our appraisal dispute process and the way we work. But just know that at some lenders, the credit underwriter will review the appraisal and may not have any particular appraisal skills in doing so. And at some even bigger lenders, they might just have a team that sort of does a quick quality assurance of an appraisal that has no appraisal background at all. So appraisal review can be very uneven. And that is also true for the appraisal dispute process at lenders. Some places will do a very robust job of this, and some places essentially the appraisal is what it is, you have to live with it. And we'll talk a little bit at 11:45, I've got my bonus slide to talk a little bit about that. So just know that, you know, I wanted to give you a quick background on how appraisals get ordered so that you kind of see where, you know, there's a lot of difference in the experience there, and it sort of matters how people are set up. Appraisal independence. You should understand that appraisers are licensed and certified at the federal level for a reason, right? That federal prisons are worse than local prisons, right? So it's critical. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, we had a huge housing crash. At least at the time, it seemed very huge. It was sort of the weak sister around real estate market crashes compared to 2008. However, out of the late 80s housing crash came RTC and a bunch of FIREA adoptions, and appraisal licensing is a part of that. And essentially during that time period, every housing crash is sort of the fault of the appraisers. If they'd done a better job, you know, people wouldn't have gotten into these situations. They wouldn't have lost so much money. And so the cornerstone of appraisal certification and licensing is appraisal independence and ethics rules. Appraisers are paid by the lender. They're never paid by the transaction. They are paid to be independent of those transactions and all the people involved with them. So just know that this is a big thing, and appraisers put not just their livelihoods, but incarceration on the line for maintaining this independence. And so know that when you're dealing with an appraisers, they kind of always have this radar around whether or not they're ethically and morally acting in the accordance with their uniform standards of professional practice, which is a little weird because I think sometimes people don't see that of appraisers, that they kind of have this very unique requirement around this. Property inspections is kind of a big thing that's going on now. Since COVID, the way appraisers inspect housing has sort of expanded to something called a desktop appraisal, which is where appraisers don't leave their house, a drive-by appraisal, which is where they don't go into the house. There are something called property inspection waivers through the agencies, where you don't get an appraisal at all because there is essentially an automated value model being run behind the scenes that is telling people what the value of the house is without looking at it. Think Zillow or Zestimate, right? Whether or not these desktop drive-by appraisals will continue in the first mortgage space is a question mark. Once we get past COVID, hopefully, we'll go back to requiring the full inspection. And in the purchase space, it seems like most people are opting out of these rather limited scope appraisal assignments, because, right now I think COVID is at least enough under control that people feel comfortable doing home inspections. So just know that there's a bunch of different things that are going on inside the appraisal industry around how you engage an appraiser and why. There used to be about 120,000 licensed appraisers in the profession 10 years ago. We're down to 45,000 licensed certified appraisers today, so that number's cut in half. And so they're starting to become this sort of big disrupt in the appraisal industry because there's just not a whole lot of people going into it. Part of that, of course, is because it's very hard to become a licensed appraiser, not particularly taking the exam portion of the appraisal trainee, but getting the actually in the field experience. And so, a lot of appraisers won't take on trainees because a lot of states require that the fully licensed appraiser do the inspection. And therefore it's sort of like, why would I do all this work with somebody as a trainee when I could just do it myself? I mean, there's no real time savings. So industry is trying to figure that out. We'll see what they come up with. But there's also a bunch of new technology in this space that potentially is why I think a lot of our appraisers are saying, hey, how much future there is in appraising. And so it's tough. Any questions on any of that? Nope. Someone had asked the question, when can I talk to an appraiser? And this is really just basically right out of Dodd-Frank. There was a lot of confusion back in 2008 after the housing crisis about who could talk to who and appraisal independence and all of that. And so a lot of appraisers were saying, hey, you can't talk to me, the home value code of conduct, things like this. So when Dodd-Frank came out in 2010, this is right out of it. Agents may talk with appraisers to provide additional information around the property, contracts, all of that. Just to make it very, very clear, as an agent working on a transaction, before the appraisal is turned in, you absolutely have the right and should take the opportunity to talk to the appraiser about what you know in real estate. What I'm always telling agents is, as agents, you are market makers. And what I mean by that is you are advising buyers and sellers every single day on the price of real estate. Appraisers don't do that at all, right? They are not market makers, and you hope that they aren't. An appraiser who said, oh, home prices are rising so fast, housing affordability is so bad, I got to do my part to keep prices down. That would be market making. It is also not what appraisers do. Appraisers are market takers. The market tells them what to do. This is a very important fact. Write this down. We do not pay appraisers for their personal opinion. You should have a radar as an agent when an appraiser is giving you their personal opinion, because we don't pay them for that. We pay them for their professional opinion. Their professional opinion is driven by the market. The market tells them what to do. So how would you know that an appraiser is giving you their personal opinion? Well, when they say things like, I do, the I do statement. I make a $5,000 adjustment for pools. Well, that's great if it were up to you, and it is not, right? That's a personal opinion. Sometimes the market pays you a lot for pools, and sometimes the market pays you nothing for pools. It is up to the market, not up to the appraiser. Unfortunately, a lot of appraisers are trained 20, 30 years ago when they were learning how to be appraisers and walking behind their mentor with their baby clipboard, taking notes, and the mentor appraiser said, see these renovated kitchens and baths? You make a $5,000 adjustment for those. So the appraiser wrote that down. And for the last 30 years, they've been making a $5,000 adjustment for a renovated bathroom. Well, maybe 30 years ago, that might've been the right adjustment, but it clearly is not the right adjustment today. I mean, you cannot do a renovated kitchen or a bath today for $5,000. And so every assignment, effectively, when you're new to a marketplace, when you're new to what's going on, the appraisers have to think about what's going on in that market and what the market is paying for the items that they need to adjust. I'm going to make the argument that as an agent, you come to that same sort of equation, but you come to it from a different way. You come to it from a market maker standpoint, in the sense that you're working with buyers and sellers all the time, and they're telling you what they want and what they're willing to pay for stuff. And therefore, if you think about it, you kind of have a better sense of what's going on. Like, I want to buy a house and I want a renovated kitchen, and I'm willing to pay for that because I really, really want it. You would therefore would sort of have this primal understanding of where the market is and its willingness to pay for elements that are features to a house. Appraisers kind of have to come at it a different way, which is they got to look at paired sales analysis, a cost approach, or an income approach to sort of ascertain what the market is willing to pay for those elements. Like, here are all the houses with a pool, and here are the houses without a pool, and what's the difference in the price? That's what the value of the adjusting for that amenity, the pool amenity. And you might get the sense that that would change and change rather dramatically from time to time, potentially even seasonally, right? And so appraisers, they have to kind of be up with that sort of stuff all the time. And that's a huge amount of work, which is why when people go, well, the appraiser was in my house for 30 minutes. Boy, I wish I could make $500 for 30 minutes. You should know that the actual inspection portion of that assignment is literally like 1% of it. It's nothing. The rest of the work that goes into an appraisal is all done behind the scenes, from their desk, from their computer, out in the field. And it is an enormous amount of work, which is why appraisal fees are what they are. And when it becomes a complex assignment, it is really not that unusual to see an appraisal now be $1,500. I mean, we've paid plenty of appraisers more than that to do residential housing recently, because it's a tough assignment. How do you know in today's world whether or not you should be $1 million more than list price? It's a lot of work. Now, this is the point that I made up about appraisal clients, right? So now that when an appraisal is turned in, can you talk to the appraiser now, right? No, you cannot. Like we said earlier, if you're not the client, you are now, once an appraisal is completed, finished, i.e. when you care about it. Once the appraiser signs it and puts a value on that property and turns it in, that appraisal is now a confidential document between the appraiser and their client. And as an agent, you are not the client unless you paid for the report, right? And if you're getting a loan, then guess what? We're not using your report because we can't. So just know that this is the big rub in the industry, that when do you want to talk to the appraiser? Well, once the report is done and you found out that you have a problem with it. So somewhere at the lender, you have to have somebody who can bridge this gap. Prosperity Home Mortgage, we have a whole team of technical reviewers. Basically, their only job is to bridge this gap between appraisers and borrowers and agents and all of that. So they communicate in this space. That's called our appraisal dispute process. And they're the ones who sort of close that gap. Not all lenders have that, which sort of surprises me. But if agents can't talk directly to appraisers, once the report is turned in, if you want to get it fixed, how are you going to get it fixed if you don't have somebody to basically communicate in that space? So this leads me to the topic that everybody asks, which is, okay, so I can talk to appraisers before they're done with the report, but I can't after the fact. So what should I do? What should I do in this space? How can I make sure that I'm, getting them what they need, getting me the best outcome? Like Brian said, I'm a market maker. I want to tell them what I know because my perspective is super powerful. And I think that the appraisal package is the best delivery vehicle for this communication. And I know a lot of you already put together an appraisal package in the sense that if you've been an agent for a while, you pull up, a bunch of information around that sale, you put it into, yellow envelope and you leave it at the home for the home inspection. Some of you now, of course, are using technology to be your friend. And so you're delivering the same thing just electronically to the appraiser. So when the appraiser calls to set the appointment, you say, hey, I got your email. Can I send you? I have an appraisal package. I'll send it over to you electronically. I think that frankly, that is the best way of doing it, because most appraisers, they're going to pull up all the information they need to do the inspection, before they go out. And therefore, they're kind of already in the space of, what's going on with this marketplace? What am I going to do? What are going to be my comparables? And so having the appraisal package in their hand early, I think sort of helps the process. But not always. I mean, sometimes, you still give it to them right there physically. So this is my list of what should be in an appraisal package. Because it's Brian Quinlan's list, that means it's sort of by nature incomplete. However, just know that, you should use some sort of process to think about what you're going to give the appraiser. I always think that when you meet someone for the first time new, you should give them a gift, right? You go over to somebody's house, you bring a bottle of wine or whatever. And so what kind of gift could you give an appraiser? Well, you can't give them money and you can't give them alcohol, right? These would be not good things. But what you could do is you could give them a copy of a site plan, a plat, plans and specs, because appraisers have to figure out how big a house is, because that is like the one element that always goes into an appraisal, almost always is adjusted for. And so they've got to figure out how big it is. How do they do that? Well, when they're at the property, they measure it. If you've got a really big property, it may take you a really long time to get the actual, measurements around the edges. There in Atlanta, it is very hot in the summertime, hot and buggy. And so the appraiser might show up at the house and thinking, wow, this house is really big. It's 100 degrees outside. There's snakes out there in the bushes. The dog in the backyard that doesn't bite anyone is always going to bite the appraiser. And so if you've got a copy of a site plan that has the dimensions of the house on it, you just put the appraiser in a really good mood, right? Because they can verify that, a couple of measurements, make sure that it's right. And then they can get inside the house where it's air conditioned. So I always think that that's like the best place to start an appraisal package, is something that the appraiser can use them right away to basically save them some time and energy, put them in a good mood. Plans and specs, right? Permits, things like that. These are the things that can really set an appraiser into a good mood. And that's, inside the house, it's nice and air conditioned, everybody's happy. And then to have the conversation, this next element, here are the sales and listings that I used to price this home. This is the conversation that you always want to have with an appraiser, because this is where you as a market maker can engage directly with what you know about the drivers in the marketplace. So, where are the neighborhood boundaries, what amenities in the house we're selling, what homes we're competing against it. So here are the sales and listings that I use to price this home. Unfortunately, I hear from a lot of agents and they tell me, hey, appraisers, they're so defensive. They won't listen and won't take my information. And they're very standoffish, what's going on. But I also talk to a lot of appraisers, and appraisers are always telling me, these agents, they're always just trying to tell me what to do. Don't they know that I have to be independent or I will go to jail? And I've sort of boiled it down to one little trick, because I see agents, they're trying to adapt the vernacular of appraisers by using the word comparable. Here are the comps. So I don't know how many of you have met appraisers and started the conversation with, here are the comps. But you should know, this is a little trick, right? Words are powerful. Here are the comps. Comp is short for comparable. Which sales and listings show up inside of an appraisal to be comparables is the appraiser's decision, right? It's not your decision, it's their decision. They have to come up with that independently. They're getting paid for that. So when you say, here are the comps, you have literally just told them what to do. So remember, because they're supposed to be independent of the process, they've got a radar for that. So don't do that. Start off with, here are the sales and listings that I use to price this home, because that's much more neutral language. But it is important because I see a lot of appraisals and a lot of contracts that don't agree with each other. And probably the single most important element of the difference is the way that the appraisers and the agents have sort of seen the marketplace. So let me skip ahead a little bit here. I can always come back. Hopefully all of you have seen an appraisal. And on the first page of an appraisal, there is a section called the neighborhood section. On the screen right now is a clip out of what that section looks like. And you can see that in the middle of that, neighborhood boundaries are always defined, and they are always defined with an east, west, north, south boundary. See the little map with the little tack stuck in it, right? See the little red lines around that? Every time you've seen an appraisal, there is an actual boundary drawn in that appraisal. That boundary is super important because the appraiser is determining what are the marketing dynamics for the definition of that neighborhood boundary. It is not the advertised neighborhood, right? So if you're living in Sherwood Oaks, right, is a marketing name for that neighborhood. That is not the same thing as a marketing neighborhood. A marketing neighborhood is where all the market participants go when they want to buy a house. As a market maker, I'm going to argue you have a much better sense of that than appraisers do, right? You're driving people around in your car. I want to go over there and look at that house. Well, guess what? That's now part of the neighborhood. By the time you're done driving people around to see 25 houses, well, maybe in today's world, 10 houses, right? you've defined the neighborhood boundaries. If you're a listing agent, you know where the people are where else they are looking, right? Oh, we looked over that house on there. We looked at that house down the street. We looked at this one, right? That's also a neighborhood boundary. So please share this information with the appraiser, because if the appraiser defines the neighborhood very narrowly, they're only going to pull the sales and listings from that neighborhood boundary to be inside of the appraisal report. If they get the neighborhood boundary wrong, then the rest of the report is wrong. And so as an agent, you probably have a much better sense of what the neighborhood boundaries are. So when you're looking at an appraisal that's done, if it's part of the dispute process, always on a map, draw the box and see if you agree with that box, because comparable selection is probably the #1 reason I see the difference between appraisal outcomes and what agents are expecting. That make sense? Okay, so here are the sales and listing I used to price the home. Drop comps or comparables from your vocabulary. The next thing that should be in this appraisal package is a list of improvements, right? Renovations, changes to the home since it was last purchased. In the land of Google, we can all look up what our house last sold for, right? In the tax records, it's all there. Appraisers are really good at knowing that. So that's a point in time that we know this house was worth X on X date, right? But what's happened to it since then? The list of improvements, renovations, that's not written down anywhere. Appraisers can't come to that. So please, please, please provide them with that. Most sellers keep track of this because they are keeping track of it for their tax consequences, right? If you want to know the capital gains that you have on real estate, it's purchase plus renovations, right? Minus sales price. And so most sophisticated sellers will have a list of everything they've done to the home, how much they spent, and when it was done. Please provide the appraiser with that as well, because this is so critical around adjustments and context. If somebody's just recently renovated their kitchen and they spent $500,000 doing it, if you don't tell the appraiser, you might show up with an appraisal that says renovated kitchen, standard kitchen on comp #1 plus $5,000. Where'd the $5,000 come from? I don't know. Maybe the appraiser doesn't even know. Maybe 30 years ago, somebody told them to make a $5,000 adjustment for kitchens. They've been doing it ever since. If you spent $500,000 on the kitchen, guess what's probably wrong, right? Probably the $5,000 adjustment is wrong, right? Most people are going to want to have renovated, baths and kitchens inside their house, especially if it's an older home. Because it is a market driver, often people pay what it cost plus to get it, right? So if you know that everybody in this marketplace wants this type of kitchen and it costs $500,000 to do, houses don't generally sell without that, the premium is probably that $500,000 or more. And so by telling them, hey, here's all the improvements, here's what was done, here's when it was done, because improvements do depreciate, they can then put that into the context as they're thinking about what types of adjustments might be made to that property given the comparables that they select. Agents miss this all the time. I know because we do a lot of appraisal disputes, and it's the first question that I always ask. I can see in the pictures that I've got this beautifully renovated home. I can see some of the comparables in the appraisal, they are not. And it's like there's adjustments that often don't make any sense to me, and nowhere in the report does it give me any context to what was spent on this home. So if the seller knows, and they almost always know, someone who spent $500,000 on their kitchen, guess what? They know that. So get that list. New mechanicals, new roof, new siding, new HVAC system, a pool in the backyard. I've seen people spend $3 million on a pool. So tell them that they spent $3 million on a pool. It is often relevant in that marketplace that they've done that. Because that's going to give the appraiser some context for what potentially they might be making adjustments for around that. Any questions on any of that? No, I see that there were some questions in the chat. Kate, is there anything there that's relevant? No? Okay. Story of the transaction is sort of the last one that I think is a really big one and so important in today's marketplace. Right now, it looks like about 56% of all homes on the marketplace are selling for more than their list price. I mean, that's a record. We've never seen that level of above list price probably since forever. And appraisers aren't going to necessarily know how a deal came together because that's not written down anywhere unless you tell them. A lot of appraisers make the mistake of thinking that The list price is like a retail sticker price. You know, so you go into the grocery store, you want to buy a box of cookies. That box of cookies is priced at $3.65. You take it up to the cashier's register. It rings up at $4.25. Is that a problem? I mean, you bet it's a problem, right? You're shaking the cashier's register. You know, why are you trying to rip me off? These cookies are not $4.25. It says right here that they're $3.65. Appraisers often think of list price like that. You know, if I listed it for $150,000, it should sell for $150,000 or less. That is not the way it is in today's market, right? The list price is almost more like an auction price. Do I hear 150? Do I hear 160, 175, 205, right? So please tell the appraisers how the deal came together. You know, I listed this property at $499. I knew that was an aggressive price. I wanted 100 people to show up on day one. 200 people showed up on day one. 50 people put in offers. It went for $150,000 over list price. That's how that deal came together. I have 7 backup offers. So know that these multiple offers situations, that information is critical for an appraiser to understand what's going on in the marketplace today. However, it is still the appraiser's job to support the estimated value that they came up with. However, on an appraiser, you can see this before adjusted range of the comparables. They make a bunch of adjustments. You have an after adjusted range. That's critical when you're looking at an appraisal to understand what the breadth and scope of that after adjusted range is. But say the after adjusted range is 500 to 600,000. They could estimate the value anywhere in that range. They could pick 500, they could pick 600. Why would they pick 600? Well, if 7 people wanted to buy the property at 600, that is a great way to reconcile to 600,000, right? I have multiple offers on this property at 600,000. And although it is the high end of my range, I'm comfortable going there in today's marketplace. So just know that the story of the transaction is super helpful to really get, you know, the appraiser in the mindset of what's going on in the marketplace today. Questions on any of that? You can hit your space bar if you'd like, ask your question. I apologize, I can't read the chat when I'm sharing my screen. No?
Do you want me to share a couple of things that were in the chat?
Yes, please.
Okay. There's one question here that said the comps our appraiser used were from last year and there was no time of sale adjustment. If nothing has moved in the neighborhood and the market has increased 3 to 4% in value, how would you argue that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, time adjustments in today's marketplace is probably the first thing that appraisers should be looking at, particularly if they're using something from a year ago. You really want to try to find the most proximate sales and listings that you can use in appraisal in both location and time so that you don't really have to discuss this. But because inventory is relatively light at the moment, appraisers are finding themselves going a little further afield and going a little bit further back in time. When you go back in time, you have to come up with what's going on in the marketplace between when that property sold and the estimated value date, right? So when the appraiser walks through the house, that becomes the effective date of that appraisal. And that value is good as that date. It's not a forecast. In other words, they're not trying to tell you what the property will be worth down the road. And they're not telling you what it was worth in the past. They're telling you as of that day. And therefore, every comparable that is inside of an appraisal report needs to be addressed around its actual contract date, because that was the marketplace where it sold. And in a lot of places like Atlanta, I mean, last time I looked at Atlanta, you know, home prices are up 16% year over year, which means the appraiser, if they're using a sale from a year ago, they need to address what happened since that property went under contract. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do that. If you've got enough recent sales in an area, you can sort of line them up, do a paired sale analysis based on, you know, when those properties sold and what the properties are selling for now. That can be a little complicated. I see a lot of appraisers right now, because the MLS is so good at allowing them to do multiple regression around sales. They take a zip code, census tract, some whatever they think the marketing boundary is, and they'll run a regression analysis around price. say, for instance, say the price per square foot. The change in the price per square foot over time is essentially the same thing as a time adjustment. They can also take a look at any pricing indexes that are available for that particular city or local market. And then once they have that, they can put it in their appraisal report and they can say, hey, I know that in this particular price range, in this particular neighborhood, that prices are moving at X, whatever it is a year. Let's use 12% for this example because it'll be easy. That means that for every month from when that home went under contract to the effective date of the appraisal, I am making a 1% time adjustment. Appraisers are often very reluctant to make these time adjustments because, like I said, every appraisal is reviewed. All those reviewers have an opportunity to ask questions about appraisals. And one of the things that credit underwriters always seem to ask about is time adjustments. So appraisers are very, very busy, and they hate getting questions on appraisals after they've turned them in, because that means that they have to go back, stop everything that they're doing, and spend hours explaining to people who they don't know, who don't know the marketplace, about what they did with appraisal, and they get very frustrated by this, right? And as well imagined, because it's like potentially they've already collected the payment for that appraisal, and now they have to keep doing more work on it, and that makes them, less happy. However, that still doesn't mean that, so appraisers potentially will not want to make adjustments that they know that people will always be asking questions about, but tough. I mean, if the market's going up, you have to make time adjustments. It's not really, once again, this is the, you're not a market maker, you're a market taker. If the market is going up at 12% a year, you're going to make a time adjustment, and it's not up to you. You don't get to not do that because the market's telling you what to do. You have to do it. It's the same thing as every other adjustment that you make. So how would you go about disputing that? I think that, for instance, if your local MLS, and I think the one in Atlanta does a really nice job of that, you can run your own regression analysis for that particular zip code. And right there, it'll show you what the sort of average change in price is and make that part of your appraisal package. You can show that prices are up and up strongly. And that potentially, if you give that information to appraisers, they can use that as a part of their analysis as well.
How do you recommend as a buyer's agent? How do I get this information? Do I email this to the lender as soon as we go under contract? How do you recommend presenting this?
Every lender is going to work a little bit differently, but at Prosperity Home Mortgage, we essentially have a super easy way to electronically transfer purchase agreements or anything like that over to the appraisers that are working for us. So when you're working with a mortgage consultant, right, the borrower is filling out an application to get the loan, you can provide them with your appraisal package. If they give it to our mortgage consultant can load it into our system, and we'll drive that directly to the appraiser. So in our world, it's a super easy thing to do. And so that gives the buyer's agent an opportunity to opine on what they see in the marketplace. Potentially the listing agent will do the same thing, which is fine, because while the appraiser is doing their analysis, more information is always better, right? So if they're ultimately the ones who are going to make the decision about what goes into the report and how they want to adjust and all of that. But getting more information up front is never a bad thing. Any questions more on appraisal package? I do think, my personal mission is to see that, every appraiser working within our brand is taking the time to put together this information, because I really see it making a huge difference with the appraisal outcomes. I see so many disputed appraisals, and the first thing I look for is, did the agent tell you anything about the house? And so often I'm still hearing, no, I didn't really get anything. And I'm thinking, how can that be? This property went $250,000 over list price. They didn't tell you about the story of the transaction. They didn't give you a copy of the sales and listings that used to price the home and list of the improvements and renovations. I'm seeing where most of the agents within our brand are now doing this. It really does. We have a much better outcome in this space than most lenders do. And I think that's, because we're getting more intelligent about it.
Brian, it's Scott. I'll interject a little bit too. You want to take the lockbox off when you get under contract. Make a barrier. Make sure the appraiser has to come through you. And I know a lot of agents sort of feel, oh my God, every appraiser should have a lockbox key. I shouldn't have to meet them there. But we're talking about trying to avert problems, and the little bit of extra time that it would take for you to meet them at the property to give them all this information is well worth it. Also, this goes back to the quality of your lender. You know, if you're working with a buyer and you let them go to Quicken Home Loans, you're going to get what you pay for. In my opinion, they're the worst lender from an appraisal standpoint. They're paid $300 or less for a $500 appraisal, and their underwriters are so overbearing that, as Brian was kind of alluding to, that a lot of appraisers just don't make adjustments for certain things. They don't adjust for pools. They don't adjust for time, because they're going to have to come back and give a whole dissertation about why they're making those adjustments. They don't let appraisers be appraisers like Brian and Prosperity do.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I mean, not all lenders are created equal. We know that. And we talked about that a little bit earlier. A lot of lenders, especially the big national lenders, they're using these appraisal management companies. And there are some really great appraisal management companies, don't get me wrong, but there are a whole bunch of them who are taking like 60% of the appraisal fee for ordering the appraisal. I mean, what value are they really creating? And so, you know, there's a class of appraisers who do work for the full fee, and then there's a class of appraisers who do it for $100 a pop. And, you know, I think we've all been told you get what you pay for, because that's kind of one of the real true things in this world. You'd want to know what they're getting paid. I think now is a really great time to take a break, because we've been at this now for an hour. So why don't we take a break until 11:15, and then we'll get started again. Maple, are you still here? Does that make sense? Hopefully I'm not, you know, breaking any rules or requirements here. I know that we get a couple of breaks. So let's take a break now until 11:15. Yeah, we'll take a break till 11:15, and then we'll pick back up.
Brian, can you put that last slide back up so I can see it and take a picture of it?
Sure, I'll put that back up once we get started. I'll put it on that same page as well. Now, Andrea, too, I know that the copy of these slides are available somewhere. So,
well, that was one of the questions that was asked in the chat. Would we have availability to have these slides? I mean, could we have them?
Yeah. Maple, do we have a way to sort of have people drop into this presentation and grab it? Because I could send it to whoever. She's giving me the 1 minute.
So last time what we did, I sent out Scott's slides, but I didn't have your slides, and we sent Scott's out as a PDF. So if you're able to print your slides to a PDF and email me that PDF, it'll be really easy for me to give everybody a link. And then we'll just send 2 links.
That works. I'll send it to you, Maple.
Perfect.
Did that work for you?
Yes, that'll be fine.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Excellent. I'm reading through the chat. Lots of great questions.
Yeah, and you got appraisers there answering questions as you're.
Yeah.
So you have lots of help today.
No, it's interesting that we have a number of appraisers taking this course. So big shout out to you.
Yeah, I send it out to our appraisers. I said unique opportunity, you know. So
yeah, for the most part, it's like all these courses are almost always exclusively agents. So I apologize. I'm kind of speaking to the agent population and not so much to the appraisers, but I'll try to modulate a little bit.
Well, I think it's a good opportunity to be able to hear both of you guys talk, because you know they don't always get to hear you guys, all the appraisers too. So, and after hearing you guys last time, that it's a little bit different than some of our other classes, and you know you and Scott don't present very often together. So,
Hey, this is
so I send it
Kate.
out to our
Can I
appraisers.
ask a question?
What's that, Mary?
I have a question, please. Wondering if you have something in the slide deck or a flyer that would better explain time adjustments and what an appraiser would like to see regarding the regression analysis.
Yep. Yeah. So Mary, Scott's got a slide that he's going to cover specifically on that topic, because we do get a lot of questions in today's market. That's really a very hot topic. And so Scott, because he knows the local Atlanta market really well, I kind of wanted him to give us some real world examples of how he would deal with that. So he's going to take the last hour of this course, and he'll cover that.
Great, thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Kate and Maple, for doing all of the housekeeping around getting everybody their CE and all that. That is so much work, and I would be horrible at it if I had to do it. So I appreciate you doing the hard work there.
Oh,
Brian?
thank you, Kate, for helping me out today.
Brian, I just submitted 2 questions. First question was, if a borrower is, getting an appraisal to secure the mortgage, is the appraiser, when he does the appraisal, is he providing a true actual value of the home, or just like enough data to support the contract price?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question in the sense that are appraisals really contract verification for a purchase transaction, or are they really a true estimated value like you would if you had no, sort of data point? And it's a tricky one. I mean, at the end of the day, the definition of market value, which is in every appraisal report, indicates that you are going to get a true estimated market value. That's the scope, that's the assignment. However, I think that what we know is true about real estate prices is that they are not a point, right? So, nothing is down to the penny in real estate. The truth about a price for real estate is that it is a range and a probability. And so when I think about appraisals, I think about the adjustments are made, and there's this after adjusted range that is the bottom of the appraisal grid. And that range is telling you that this home is worth something in this range with a increasing or decreasing probability, right? So you might say, the estimated range on this home is 120 to 140. And there is a 95% probability that the sales price of this home, the market value today, is within that range, right? So that's kind of like the way I think about it. But the appraiser is forced by the industry to pick a point. And a lot of times, if the sales price is a point within that range, appraisers often pick it, right? And then I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, because you'd say, okay, well, if the probability is 95% between 120 and 140, and the people bought the house for 132, right? Why not pick 132? You got to give the lender a point. So the sales price is within this range and give them that point. I don't necessarily think that that's a contract verification, which in a way it maybe is. But it's also, I think a lot of people think that the appraiser is really telling you 132,500, and it's like, it's not 132,600, right? I mean, and that's not the way to think about an appraisal. An appraisal is not, and as is any market. I mean, if you're an agent and you go to sell a house, you know that 10 people are going to pay 10 different things potentially. And so you're customized and used to dealing with this sort of variability in the appetite of the marketplace. They're never going to always settle to one number. And appraisals are like that too, but lenders require appraisers to put down a number so that they can calculate LTV, which is a little bit of a misnomer. I mean, I think that's, it's just the way the industry works.
And just one follow on to that. So if a buyer is only going to get a mortgage for 50% of the contract price, they have cash, they don't want to use all their cash, so they're going to get for 50%. So I guess I never truly understood this. Does the appraisal have to meet the full contract price, or do you just have to cover the 50%?
Yeah, I mean, and the thing about it is that most lenders are going to have LTV restrictions not at 50%, right? So for an investor loan, you say it's 75. For your standard traditional owner occupied deal, it's like 80 to 90. lots of lenders go to 97% LTVs. It just depends on the loan program that the borrower is using. And so from that standpoint, the 50%, that's got nothing to do with the transaction most of the
Okay.
And so in theory, if the property was, let's say, make this example easy, $100,000 valuation, and they wanted to borrow $50,000, that's a 50% LTV. Let's say that the home didn't come in at 100, but it came in at 80. The fact that they wanted to borrow 50 doesn't change they want to borrow 50 and it appraised for 80. It just changes the LTV. And you see that happen all the time. And as long as that LTV fits inside of the loan program characteristics, it's not going to have an impact. Now, the big impact that I see isn't the LTV, because most lenders, if you're doing 80, they could do 90, they could do 95. I mean, MI, property more, the whole mortgage insurance game that goes in above 80 is a game that people play. But I see a lot of people using that tool in today's space to bridge appraisal that is mismatched from a sales price. So for instance, let's say you want to get an 80% LTV and $100,000 house, you're borrowing 80 grand, right? But the appraisal doesn't come in at 100, it comes in at 90. So now you got a problem, right? Because you can't get your 80% LTV anymore. In this space, what I see a lot of people do is they do a prepaid MI insurance, which is the same thing as typical MI. So if you think about MI, it's going to add a couple $100 to your payment or whatever, right? Over time. And then eventually you fall outside of the need for MI and it goes away. You can prepay it up front, a couple $1,000. And that means you can go from the 80 to the 90 for like $1,000 of prepaid MI. And that means that deal, even though the appraisal came in low, it means that your mortgage insurance, the payment's really not going to change. Your LTV is going to change from say 80 to 90. But because you did prepaid MI, it's like the payment doesn't change. I know that I've got some slides that actually outline that. And if people want, we could spend some time on that. But just know that that's a game that I see a lot of people playing today, is they go in with this 80% LTV, appraisal comes in a little short, they modulate and do a 90. And instead of getting MI that covers you include it in your payment all the time, which is an option, you could do that. Sometimes what people are doing is just prepaying it. And it's sort of like, how do you get $1,000 to cover a $20,000 difference, if that makes sense? Because the borrower doesn't want to pay the difference between the short appraisal and the purchase price, but they want to buy the house. So they just up the LTV. It doesn't really change their loan amount, if that makes sense.
Another point, a lot of people wonder, does the appraiser even know what the mortgage is? And in general, we don't. There's the mortgage statement and the contract. We don't look at that. So we have no idea how much somebody's borrowing. So that doesn't come into play at all.
One of the things that we do at Prosperity Home Mortgage, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a bit, is the appraisal dispute process. Not all lenders are created equal around this, because not all lenders have an appraisal organization within their umbrella. A chief appraiser essentially is an individual that managed collateral risk at an organization, and therefore that allows that organization to create a silo around collateral and do a lot of interesting things like have an appraisal panel. Some lenders will not have chief appraisers, and therefore all they can do is have salespeople. And if all you have at the lender is salespeople, they cannot order their own appraisals. It's against the law, right? Salespeople cannot refer, pick, or engage appraisers. So if a lender, all they have is salespeople, and Scott was picking on Quicken, so I'll pick on Quicken as well. It's a very lean organization. It doesn't have a chief appraiser. And so from that standpoint, they use appraisal management companies because they are required by law to do it. There's no one at the lender who can order the appraisal, so they fee that out. That's where appraisal management companies, they get half the fee for a reason, right? The lender is saving money by not having appraisers on staff. So they got to do it some way, and they use appraisal management companies. At Prosperity, we don't do it that way because we're a weird lender in the sense that 90% of what we do, even in today's market, is purchase transactions. Most lenders, 98% or more of what they do is refi transactions. Quicken is a classic example of it. That's an organization designed to do refi transactions. Probably close to 100% of the loans they do are refi transactions. And they built this big, huge machine. They do hundreds of billions of dollars of transactions. They are super efficient at it. And they have cut all the fat out of everywhere they could to streamline around this particular loan channel, right? That means no appraisers in that space, no nothing. Prosperity Home Mortgage, we're weird. All we do is purchase transactions. And you think, well, why is that? Well, guess what? Because we're a mortgage company owned by a realty company. It's why we exist. We exist to do purchase transactions. And so from that standpoint, we know appraisals are super important for purchase transactions. So we spend the money to have a chief appraiser and a whole team of appraisers so that we can essentially try to get appraisals right every single time, because it's important to us. We're doing purchase transaction. If all we did was refi transactions, guess what? Appraisals aren't that important. You save the money, because if you don't like it, just pick up the phone, get another one, right? I mean, there's millions of refi transactions out there. It's just not what we're baked to do, because we're owned by a realty company. Okay, let me share my screen again. I think we're all back. Hopefully that was the, everybody got a little snack, picked them up, not getting too tired. We're trying to make this fun, right?
And if I can just interject real quick and ask everybody to make sure that if you're here for CE, that you have your video on, and we will be taking screen captures. Thank you.
Okay, so Maple, tell me if I got everything back working again. You should see one big screen that says appraisal components at the top of it. She's nodding her head yes.
You do. Yep, I see it.
Okay, good. Appraisal components. How do we want to spend a lot of time on this? Mostly, what I really want to cover here is the below grade living space. I always get questions about this. And did they give me credit for my basement? Appraisals have this convention of counting above grade and below grade square footage. So when you're looking at a property, you should ask yourself, does a part of that wall have dirt on it? Because that's the sort of the appraisal international architectural standard around what is and is not below grade. If you walk into a house and you walk into the first story of it and the lower floor has dirt on it, that means it's a basement. Doesn't mean that you're not getting credit for it. It's just there's two lines on an appraisal. One's the above grade square footage and one's the below grade square footage. Why do appraisers do it this way? Well, because they were told to do it this way. And they, when the industry put together these forms many years ago, it tried to differentiate between the value of above grade square footage and below grade square footage. Because most of the time, if you're in the country, you've got a two-story house with a basement. That basement might be in the ground all the way around. And therefore, because it's in the ground all the way around, that basement, I mean, think about like New England, house built in the 1850s, right? That basement's like a cellar. It's not worth much, but it's there and you want to give it credit, but it's below grade square footage. It's not the 1850s anymore. Time has moved on and not all basements are created equal. In fact, I've seen homes in California, Emerald Bay, you got a $50 million house. And when you drive up to it on the street, you see this little 600 square foot improvement with a garage. And you're thinking, how in the world is this little 600 square feet of improvement above grade and the garage worth $50 million? And so you walk into the front door and look out the window and you recognize that there are 10 stories that go down to the beach, right? Technically, all of those stories are below grade because the front of them are into the cliffside. You know what the most valuable floor on that building is? Not the above grade square footage, the one that walks out to the sand beach, right? And appraisers in the marketplace, they know that. They're just doing the way the form tells them. So in that particular example, the above grade square footage is going to be relatively small. It's still going to be a very big house. It's all going to be below grade, and that does not matter. The appraisers can make the appropriate adjustments for the type and nature and fit and finish and desire of that basement, even though it happens to be on another box on the grid. This drives agents completely nuts because they think that they're not getting value for what is in the lower box. And it's just in another box. So as long as the appraisers understand how the market is perceiving that improvements, and that I think is where the agents can add some value. If you are, out to the outside on three sides, even though the front part of that foundation is underground, the backyard, you might have a pool and a tennis court and all of that, and you might have an outdoor kitchen, and that might be the part of the house that is the most desirable. So please let the appraiser know that, hey, people, when they bought this, they really love this lower finished area because it's actually the highest amenity of the whole house. The fact that that upper story's got some bedrooms in it is nice, but these people have put some real cost finishes into this lower space. And I want you to make sure that as you're looking to the marketplace, that you're accounting for that. Because just because it's below grade doesn't mean someone didn't spend $1 million on it. If it really is tied to a pool and a fire pit and all of that stuff. So you'll know that as you're looking at the property. Just make sure that you're having that conversation with the appraiser when it comes up. Does that make sense? Right now we've got legal accessory units, sometimes called ADUs, attached dwelling units. And that's a big, big thing in today's world because, like I said, single family zoning is now starting to be outlawed in a number of places around the country because of the affordability of housing. There's a bunch of places in California right now where they are just allowing people to drop these little shipping container houses into their backyards. That's a thing. And in certain marketplaces, they're getting $4,000 and $5,000 a month rent for the little shipping container they dropped in their backyard. Think Austin, Texas. And so how do appraisers deal with that? Well, challenging, right? First, you got to make sure that it's a legal conforming use, which is you got to look to the zoning and the municipality for that. And then you start looking for comparables that sell with and without these amenities. But it can be a real challenge because sometimes a property won't have the ADU there yet, but has the ability to put it. And that's a value component. So know that as you know, the lack of housing nationally is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. Affordability is becoming an even bigger problem. A lot of municipalities are trying to solve for getting more places for people to live, and having these legal accessory units is a way that people are trying to fix that. And it can, you know, think about it. If you rent a place for $3,000 a month, do the math. I mean, you're adding hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially in value to that structure. And so you should know that. Of course, the other thing you should know is there's legal accessory units and then there are illegal accessory units. Just because you drop the shipping container into your backyard doesn't mean that you can legally do that, which means the municipality has the right to require you to remove it. Appraisers can't give you value for something that's illegal, right? And just appraisers got to keep up with stuff. You got to keep up with stuff on that and understand. Just, I mean, homeowners often will put kitchens and whatnot into their basements. And sometimes municipalities allow it and sometimes they don't. But if they don't allow it, they always reserve the right to force you to remove it, which means the appraiser really can't give you value for it. And that's where things get tricky. Questions on any of that? This is the neighborhood slide that we talked about. Adjustments. I don't want to steal Scott's fire. He's going to talk a little bit about adjustments. Just know that this goes back to earlier when I was talking about, you know, it's up to the market, not up to the appraiser. And this is tricky because a good local appraiser who works in an area exclusively, they'll have a pretty good sense of what they adjust things for because they're doing it all the time. And therefore they might say something, hey, well, you know, for a 2-car garage versus no garage, I make a $20,000 adjustment. I do this based on market characteristics. And if they've figured out that analysis recently and keep it up to date, then they can make that statement. It's not really so much a personal opinion as it is a market opinion if they've done it recently, but then contrast that with an appraiser who doesn't work in an area and then just say, you know, I always adjust stuff at $50 a foot for the additional GLA. Gross living area. Well, that's a personal opinion. What's the market doing? And a good example is, you know, how do you figure out what that adjustment should be? And in this particular example, you know, I've sort of shown you how a paired sale analysis works. So you've got 3 properties here, one of them being the subject. They're all this identical. You love this, right? You know that this is a real world example because of the addresses, right? Fantasy Drive and Fiction Way, right? So this is just a made up world, but these properties are identical except for their square footage. One of them is 100 square feet bigger than the subject. One of them is 100 square feet smaller than the subject. you can see the sales price of these properties. So essentially what an appraiser would do is they would look for, these examples in the real world. They would then allocate them out to see what the difference in the sales price is versus the difference in the square footage. So for instance, comp number 1, comp number 3, they are $10,000 difference in price. They are 200 square feet difference in size. The difference is $50 a foot. Therefore, you can make adjustments on them for the difference in square footage from the subject property. That is a classic pair sale analysis that an appraiser would do, and do as often and frequently as they feel necessary to keep up with the marketplace. And then they would make.
Sorry to interrupt, but we can't see the slide. I think you're stuck on the appraisal component slide still.
Oh, that's weird. Why didn't it move? Can you see it now?
No, still can't see it.
That is very strange. Well, let me see if
I don't know if everybody else is still on the appraisal component slide.
Let me see if I can reshare, if it syncs it back up. How about now?
Okay, that changed.
And does it now say, what does the market say the exact square footage is worth?
Yes.
That's weird. Okay, so this is my example. You got 3 properties here. They're the same except for the square footage. You see that, the little blue lines drawn in the middle. One's 100 square feet bigger, one's 100 square feet bigger, smaller. You just take the difference in the 2 sales prices. One's at 230, one's at 220. That's a $10,000 difference for 200 square feet. So that's, the difference is $50 a foot. So because the subject property is $1,600, 1,600 square feet, you make, $5,000 for those property, one up, one down. Does that make sense? And that adjustment is extracted from the marketplace based on these 2 sales. And that is the cornerstone of all adjustments for the sales comparison approach. There's a bunch of different ways to, come up with adjustments. This is the classic way of doing it. You take 2 homes that are the same except for one feature, and then you look to the difference in sales price. You would, of course, want to do this more than just, 2 homes. You would want to look at enough homes to get a sense that it wasn't just some weird anomaly in these properties. But that's how appraising and appraising adjustments come up to. Questions on any of that? You can use this sales comparison approach to come up with adjustments. You can use the cost approach to come up with adjustments. You can use the income approach to come up with adjustments. The cost approach is pretty simple. You don't necessarily see that approach in appraisals anymore, but it is just essentially the concept that what something costs is what it's worth. Now, you have to be a little careful about that because, timber prices are way up and you have to have entrepreneurial profit as a part of that cost. So, to go out and buy a cinder block is, whatever it is. When you put it into a house, somebody has to put it into that. So there's a cost to do it. And then there's the profit that you make for having done it. And so a lot of people will say, well, God, this thing is $200 a foot. It's not, $200 a foot to buy a piece of wood. But when it's assembled, there is a sort of 3 elements that go into cost. But once it's in place, appraisers can often look at that. A good example of that is like horse properties. When people buy horse properties, it's because they like horses, and horses like to run off. So you have to have horse fencing. And if anybody who's done horse property know, this horse fencing is super expensive. And if you got 50 acres that have been put into fencing, you could have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this. And if you're buying a horse property and you're that kind of person, you know the value of that element, and therefore that cost is a component of its value. And then the next thing is the income approach. Residential appraisers don't do a lot of stuff with the income approach. However, that doesn't mean that the market doesn't do it all the time. I know a lot of you have sold investment properties, and because you've sold investment properties, what people are essentially buying is the cash flow. So one of the things I think about the income approach is it's great because I get a question from people like, I got a 2-bedroom house and a 3-bedroom house. What's the adjustment for the bedroom? And you could do it by doing this pair sale analysis. The other way you could do it is if there was enough rental information in that marketplace for 2 bedrooms and 3-bedroom properties, And you could calculate a gross rent multiplier, which sounds complicated, but is not. It's just, if you take the rent of a property and its sales price and you divide it, you will get something called a gross rent multiplier, right? So if you got a property and it sells for $100,000 and it rents at $1,000 a month, right? What's the gross rent multiplier? You just divide it. Once you have that, you can use that multiple to essentially divide the difference in things like rent. So if it's $1,000 for a 2-bedroom, but it's $1,500 for a 3-bedroom, right? What is the value? If the gross rent multiplier is 100 or 10, and you've got $500 for the extra bedroom, what's the extra bedroom worth? Well, guess what? It's $5,000. so that's that whole income approach is something that a residential appraiser doesn't look at that often because it's a little bit more narrow. It would apply more to an investment property. But as we know, a lot of the marketplace out there is investment or investor driven. Even in today's world, we're finding after 2008, there were a bunch of large residential REITs that were created all over the country to buy up real estate. It's still buying up real estate even today. And therefore, they're just looking at real estate as an investment option. And they basically are driving an income approach on that. And they're competing to buy homes in today's market as well. And so they're always a component of it in the marketplaces that they play. Question there? I see the light is flashing.
I have a question, please. This is.
Yeah, Mary, you're muted again, but you were started.
Sorry about that. So how would one adjust for floor level in a high-rise condominium?
And once again, right, it would depend on the marketplace. Sometimes when you have new construction condominium in their high rise, the developer will set a floor premium, which is in some regards arbitrary. If there is a view element available to that particular project, the developer might say, hey, you know, for every floor, I'm going to charge an extra 1% or 0.5% or whatever, $500 or $1,000. It's a little bit like lot premiums in single family subdivisions. The developer can kind of get away with it because it's set and set arbitrarily. But once the market starts to work on it, those floor premiums or lot premiums, they may hold up in the marketplace or they may not. It's up to the market. And therefore, I find like in condominium properties, if you are the northeast corner down in Florida with a view of the ocean, everybody loves this, right? Depending on which coast you're on. If you're on the Atlantic coast, it's one thing. If you're on the Gulf Coast, it's another. Because, you know, there's a sunrise, sunset premium. There's a view and the light, the way it comes through your unit premium, right? If you're in the northwest corner, you tend to be in the shadow all the time, right? And so people don't necessarily like that as much. And so what side of the building you're on can be a premium. And then what you can see from your floor is a premium. In New York, a lot of times what will happen is that you get high enough to essentially see over the buildings that are in front of you. So there's a premium. But the difference between like a 6 and 7 floor might not be any, you might not notice that in the marketplace, even though the developer might have said, hey, I'm going to charge an extra $1,000 per floor. Once the units start reselling, some of it might hold up, like the penthouse might always have a premium, and maybe a couple of stories underneath the penthouse, if they maintain the view, have a premium. But once you're down to like 3, 4, and 5, it doesn't hold up because the view is materially the same. And so the market doesn't really account for that. But sometimes they do. It just, and the appraisers kind of have to sort of figure that out every time they look at the project and to see what's going on. It's complicated, for sure. Okay, any questions on any of that? I'm looking around at my time here, and I think I am dangerously close to my bonus slide. So I'm going to skip if I can. Are my slides moving? Keys to remember, do you see that? Okay.
Yes.
I'll just echo a little bit about the reconciliation section of an appraisal. This is the sort of the traditional second page of an appraisal at the very bottom. You can see that in this example, you've got the box that's marked as is. Appraisals don't always have to be as is. They can be, as you can see, there are a couple of different boxes here. You can be as is, there's the property selling for what it is. Then you can be subject to plans and specs, subject to certification. There's different elements that appraisers can account for in the way that they are producing their final estimated value. As is the traditional one we see in residential. It means you're buying what's there. Plans and specs are pretty much what you'd expect them to be if you're buying a new house or a home that's in substantial renovation. And then subject to certifications. This whole certification thing comes up a lot when you've got like well and septic, you've got mold or something like that, where the appraiser sees something in the property that they're not the expert in. And appraisers are not home inspectors, nor should they be. They're just sort of the eyes and ears of the lenders. And so if they're walking through the property and they're downstairs and there's this 4-inch crack running across the whole part of the foundation, they're gonna look at that and go, wow, that's a problem, but I have no idea what that problem is. So in the perfect world, what they'll do is they'll take a picture of it and then they'll hit this subject to structural certification. And they're saying is, I see something, I don't know what it means, but I'm sure it means that something's wrong. So why don't you get an expert out there to take a look at it and tell you what's going on? It might be something, it might not be. And that's where that whole certification, I see this a lot for mold. Mold's a big issue in a number of places, especially down south. If you leave a home in Florida closed up for any length of time, it'll basically turn into a fungus factory. Now, what you should know about fungus is sometimes it can kill you and sometimes it's delicious and you put it in your salad, right? And so not all molds are created equal, and appraisers there's no way to know. It's like if you're a person who's foraging for mushrooms, everyone will tell you don't do this because you don't know the difference between the mushrooms that are growing in your yard. Some of them, you throw them in your salad and you're happy, and some of them will kill you, right? And they often look alike. This is also true for mold. There's no way for an appraiser to see, they see this black mold on the wall. Maybe it's completely harmless. You put some bleach on it and it's gone, or potentially it's black mold that will cause everybody in the house to die. So in that situation, appraisers are right to just raise their hand and say, somebody should certify this mold as not being toxic mold that's going to kill everybody, because guess what? Dead people do not pay their mortgages, right? Agents often freak out about this sort of thing because they're like, oh my God, it's the end of the world and my deal's going to come unwound. No, it's just, everybody wants to get a little bit of an expert out there to make sure that the borrower is getting into something that's a known due diligence. Because if it's, no kind of mold not to worry about, it's pretty easy. There are a whole bunch of companies that basically they just sample it, send it off to the lab, and they'll tell you exactly what species of mold it is. And maybe it's no big deal, and maybe it is, but you should know the difference. Same thing with settlement cracks. Older homes are almost always moving around. That's the nature of wood and block and concrete and all that stuff. It is a permeable surface, and therefore, it expands and contracts. So there's going to be any house of any age that's got cracks into it. At some point, however, maybe the house is sliding down the hill and you might want to know that, but an appraisers cannot make that determination. They're not experts in that space. However, structural engineers or foundation engineers, they're very, very good at knowing this sort of thing. And therefore, if you're buying a house for $1 million, you might want to know if it's sliding down the hill. That is not an inappropriate question to ask of the lender to make sure they're safeguarding the borrower's investment in that space. Does that make sense? And I'm going to skip because we're at that time for the bonus slide. Unfortunately, we did not get into all the minimum property eligibility standards for different investors. We will send out these slides. You can kind of read through that. I think most people are pretty familiar. If you're not, every single investor, Fannie, Freddie, FHA, VA, they all have handbooks that are all online. If you type in FHA minimum property eligibility standards into Google, it will point you to their landing page, and there's a section in there. It'll tell you exactly what they require homes to be in order for them to be, able to insure in the FHA space, Fannie and Freddie, in order for them to take them as collateral. It's good to sort of have a link to those pages. They change all the time. Used to be FHA was really, really strict. They wouldn't let people touch anything or, railings and cracked windows and peeling paint. They've sort of softened up on some of that in their guidelines over the last couple of years. Fannie and Freddie, after 2008, they tightened up a bunch on their guidelines. And so people used to say, well, I never got a repair condition on a conventional loan. Well, guess what? It's the 21st century. We see them all the time, because if it's broken, Fannie and Freddie, they have minimum property eligibility standards, and it is the right to the lender to require them to be fixed, because they want to sell the loan to Fannie and Freddie. So then this last slide, my bonus slide going into our last break before Scott takes over, is vetting the lender and their appraisal process. I know for a fact that agents vet lenders all the time, and you should, right? If you're the listing agent and you've got 29 offers on a house, you're going to have to stack those offers in a way to present them to your seller and advise them which property, which offer they should take. And do you always take the highest price? Well, no, right? You're going to take the offer that has the most likelihood of actually, ending up at the closing table. If there's a lender there and the last 10 deals you did with that lender or your office did with that lender, none of them closed, guess what? I see agents all the time going back to the people submitting those offers and say, use another lender. If you use this lender, I will not recommend that the seller take this offer. And that is part of the due diligence. Part of what you get paid to be an agent is to advise them on the risk of non-performance on these offers. So vetting the lender totally makes sense to me. You should make sure that you vet lenders if you've got multiple offers. Now, if you have a property that's been on the market for 500 days, nobody showed up, and you get one offer, guess what? You probably don't have as many options, but that just doesn't happen that much in today's world. So vetting that lender is a big part of what the listing agent's going to do. But how many of you take the time to vet the lender for their appraisal process? I would love to take credit for this idea, but it was not mine. I had agents come and tell me that they do this, and I think it is brilliant, so I share it wherever I can. Every lender is required by law to set the qualifications and the credentials of the appraisers that they use. The lender sets this. It is written down in policy. How do I know it's written down in policy? Well, hello, I get audited for it every year. I have a policy of the qualifications and credentials of the appraisers that we use, and we spend a lot of time on our local panel making sure that we have the very best appraisers that we can. Why do I do this? Well, because I'm lazy. If I get the best appraisers to come and work for me, like D.S. Murphy, right, then I can be rest assured that I'm going to have fewer appraisal problems, right? If I have fewer appraisal problems, then I have to do less work, because chief appraiser means I guarantee that I'm gonna get the appraisal right. So if I get it wrong, I've got to fix it. If I have the most highly qualified appraisers on my panel doing the work, I have fewer and fewer problems, and therefore less work to do. But every lender sets these qualifications and credentials. It is not, even if they use appraisal management companies, it is not up to the appraisal management company to set the qualifications and credentials. Think how bad that would be. An appraisal management company, their margin is the appraisal fee. They're looking for appraisers to do work for them for less and less money, right? If they can find an appraiser to work for them for $100, they're going to take it. That doesn't mean that they're looking for the most qualified appraiser. In fact, it probably means they're looking for the least qualified appraiser. So you can't have an appraisal management company control the qualifications and credentials. It has to be the lender. That's required by law. All lenders are audited for it, and it is written down. Because it is written down, could you ask the lenders to share that with you up front before you even start the process? Yes, you could, and yes, you should, in my opinion, because this is called skillful complaining. Right? If you've got multiple offers to pick from, you're picking the lenders who are most likely to perform, and then you ask them, hey, can you tell us a little bit about your appraisal process? Do you use local appraisers? Yes or no? How do you know that they're local? Well, what does that mean? In our world, it's 5 miles, 10 miles, 30 miles. 5 miles for an urban location, 10 miles for a suburban location, 30 miles for a rural location. That's the house and the appraisers. We want them to be in close proximity to each other. Why? Well, guess what? A local appraiser is going to know what's going on in a neighborhood where a non-local one won't. So make sure that they're local. Have they ever appraised in that neighborhood before? For us, we want appraisers who at a minimum have been appraising in that marketplace for 5 years, right? They didn't just show up there tomorrow. I mean, it's like, we've got to know that they've been around long enough to understand what's going on. So that's another qualification that's written down in our policy, which I could share with you if you asked, right? So every lender has that. I think it's great to vet them upfront as you're like looking through these multiple offers. You want to get the lender to promise you that they're going to execute around their appraisal process in a certain way. Do you have an appraisal dispute process? What does it look like? At Prosperity Home Mortgage, if there's a problem with the appraisal, especially around the mismatch between sales price and appraised value, when those two things are not the same thing, we know it's a problem, right? You call them low appraisals, cut appraisals, things I cannot mention on polite company. We call them sales variances, but anytime there's this difference, I know it's a problem. I know that your loan cannot fund if you're $10,000 low on the sales price, right? So we pick up the phone and we call you. That's our dispute process. Well, why? Why do we do it that way? Because we know it's a problem. We're a lender owned by a realty company. We know that we're going to have to fix that because we work for you. We get you on the phone. How else would you want the appraisal dispute process to work other than the people who can fix the problem, pick up the phone and call you, as opposed to what most lenders do, which is don't have a process, have no way to know what's going on. You don't know who to talk to. Now you've got a problem. You can't sort it all out. Get them to promise you this upfront, because if they do, right, especially in our world, right, I'm going to call you. It's easy. If you got a problem, guess what? Phone's going to ring. Someone who can fix it's going to call me. That's the dispute process. To me, that's best in class. But every lender is going to tell you what they do in that space. And you would want to know upfront, because if you know all of this upfront before you accept the offer, later that week, the phone rings, it's the appraiser. Now you've got the opportunity to vet whether or not they're delivering on the promise that they made. And if the appraiser's coming from 300 miles away, when they promised you they'd be local, that's a problem. If they aren't getting paid the full appraisal fee, like they told you, but they're getting paid $75, that's also a problem. You were promised something, and if it doesn't deliver, then you can call the lender back and say, hey, all those things you told me that were going to happen, none of them are happening. Can you fix it? That is skillful complaining, right? They made you a promise. Now you can hold them to it. As opposed to don't do anything, have some horrible appraisal show up after the fact and then try to figure it out. That is not a plan for success. Any questions on any of that? Okay. Well, why don't we take a break until the top of the hour, noon, if I've got my computer is still working correctly. And then Scott's going to take over. Scott, hopefully you're still there.
I am.
Scott is nothing if he isn't dedicated. He listened to my presentation before, so I appreciate Scott listening through. Let's take that quick little break, and then I'll turn my slide stuff over to Scott, and then we will be off to the races.
Very good.
Thanks.
Brian, can you do me a favor and send me your PowerPoint when you get a chance?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll do that.
Perfect, thank you.
Alexandra, are you back? Yes, you are. I see your question around the home inspection and giving that to the appraiser. It's really traditional that you don't offer that up as a standard course of action to the appraiser when they're doing their inspection. Although occasionally, I know we, the lender, will ask for it. When we ask for it, at least at Prosperity Home Mortgage, it would be awesome if you could provide that with us. We're usually trying to accommodate something that somebody's seen, and we're hoping that the inspection will address it. But a lot of home inspections are done in such a way as to sort of always find something to sort of justify their cost. And you don't want the appraisers necessarily to see about the dripping faucet or the little missed something here or there, because appraisers usually don't add that to the repair items. Home inspections are often a negotiated topic, and so you don't want to put the appraiser in that space as well, because that, you know, anything that is a repair item in the appraiser does need to be addressed, but not necessarily always in the inspection.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, I think we're all back. Now you got the, you got the exciting dynamic portion of today's class. I'm going to turn it over to Scott. Scott, thank you so much. Screen's all yours. Oops, Scott, you're muted though.
Hey, Scott, nobody can hear you. You have to unmute.
Yeah, it's weird. It's really weird. It's like he's talking, but it's transcribing him at the bottom. I don't even know.
All right, sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah, that's a Zoom function I'd have never even seen before, that it's like you talk while you're muted and it types it out. Nice work. I'm gonna have to figure out how you do that.
All right, so let's get into it. I think what's great about this presentation with Brian and I doing it together is you get a perspective from the lender side. And I talk about that a lot in my classes. We refer to, see if I can turn that on. We refer to what's going on the lender side, how the lender looks at things, how a lender deals with the appraisals. But now you've got a good insight as to how Prosperity does it. I don't know how to turn that off. Let me see. Oh, there it is. Subtitle settings. Bottom, top, below. How to turn them off. Maple will come in here and help me turn them off in a minute.
There you go. Nice. I like it. It's a great function. I didn't even know that Zoom did that. So that's cool.
Bottom left corner.
Yeah. Where's your, it's usually
like right in here, right there, next one over.
This one?
It should be, what's that one right there? Yep, right click it.
And
Oh, it said toggle. Let's see.
stop subtitles.
There we go.
All right. See, I learn something new every day. I learned that trick from Brian last time we taught about pushing the space button to speak up. So, Brian, before I let you completely sit back and relax, I think you have a really unique opportunity here with Prosperity Mortgage that we don't know of any other lender that will do this. Brian talked about it a little bit about pre-listing appraisals. And hopefully all of you at Harry Norman are familiar with our consultation appraisal. It's a lot more than a typical pre-listing appraisal. We want to come out, look at the house with you and the seller, try to find if there's anything else that can be done to the house to maximize the value. We will stay on with you as your consultant throughout the transaction, updating the appraisal. And then most importantly, we'll be there to fight a bank appraisal if one were to come in low afterwards. But you've got a lot of people will ask, well, can that appraisal be used for lending purposes? And the answer is generally no. But Brian's got a little bit of a unique insight for you, and I'll let him explain that.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. A lot of times we're finding that, the market's super dynamic now, and agents are doing pre-listing appraisals, which, since we're noticing that, and we have this very large panel of appraisers, and we're always here to try to make our realtor partner look great. We'll more than willing to order the pre-listing appraisal for you. I mean, you'll still have to pay for it. But if we order the appraisal, we basically make ourselves the client, i.e. Prosperity Home Mortgage, which means, like I said earlier, as long as the client is a lender and not you, the agent or the homeowner, then potentially that appraisal can be used for financing purposes. You would still need to get it updated, right? I mean, once the deal goes under contract, that information has to be added to the appraisal. But once it's added to the appraisal, you know who would use that for financing purposes? Well, we would. And one of the reasons I like pre-listing appraisals that are done that way, making the lender the client, is in today's world, we're seeing a lot of transactions going all cash. And you feel really bad for these homeowners because they're like, hey, I want to buy a house really, really badly, but I'm keep losing out to all these all cash offers. So how in the world are they going to solve that? Well, at Prosperity Home Mortgage, we've created basically something that is a lender commitment letter, but most lender commitment letters aren't worth the paper that they're printed on because they are not underwritten. What they say is, hey, this borrower, they would be qualified for a loan if everything they told us is true, but we haven't looked at it, right? So it's got all of these contingencies on it. At Prosperity Home Mortgage, we created something called Buyer's Advantage. And a Buyer's Advantage is basically a lender commitment letter, but we underwrite it. So it's a loan commitment with two contingencies. There's a contingency for the appraisal and there's a contingency for title, but it's a loan commitment. It's underwritten. So we've underwritten the borrower. So that Buyer's Advantage, if you take a little extra work, i.e. we own our own title companies and we own our appraisal process. So could we clear the appraisal piece of that condition? Yes, we could, right? We get a pre-listing appraisal. The other thing that we do, since we own our own title, we could make sure that the title work is all done as well. So now that Buyer's Advantage loan commitment with two contingency, one for appraisal, one for title, we've just cleared the two contingencies. We cleared the appraisal, we cleared title, which means now you have a loan commitment that is non-contingent, i.e. same as cash, right? So that's an awesome way for you, if you know that this house is going to sell in a day with 30 offers and 10 of them are going to be all cash and you want to be able to compete, you can upgrade your borrower by having them work with one of our mortgage consultants to get your Buyer's Advantage into basically a non-contingent loan commitment. So yes, pre-listing appraisals, I see people doing it. It's a little bit of a hassle, but where you really, where it really shines, it makes such a difference and helps people, be the winning bid.
And the way to do this is to coordinate with your Prosperity Loan Officer. So touch base with them, they'll get it set up with Brian and they will contact us or other appraisers on their panel to do your appraisals. So very good. Well, if this has sparked some interest and you really think you want some more appraisal guidance and knowledge, we have many more classes. Kate, who's helping out today, rewrote our Appraiser's Guide to CMA class. She also has a great architecture class. So watch for all of those. We're putting them all out there through your education department. So, All right, what's going on in Atlanta market? You know, supply has been an issue for quite a long time. This isn't anything new. The volume of listings is at an all-time low. Construction is what's there to, construction is what could bring us out of this, but new construction is being impeded by the availability of developed lots and how expensive they've gotten. And then of course, the lack of building materials. Right now, Canada was one of the biggest suppliers of a lot of the lumber that we use, and they're still primarily shut down. So until that opens up and other streams, a lot of builders are kind of hamstrung. They can't, and they're holding back. They don't want to sell properties that they're not able to start building. So then they're creating this urgency as well, because they're only going to release 2 or 3 properties at a time. And the whole thing's kind of spiraling into a frenzy. And so we'll talk about how to deal with that. You know, and existing home sellers, you know, are real reluctant because they don't have a replacement property. Actually, we're seeing a lot of changes with, you know, the homeless rate in Atlanta has raised quite a bit. And I'm just kidding, but it has to do with all these sellers who sell their house and don't have a place to go. So a lot going on the supply side. The demand side has been strong. Interest rates are low. COVID actually created more pent-up demand, and it also changed the way in which people use their house with working from home. For instance, in-ground pools are very much in demand right now. So appraisers need to take that into consideration and make sure they're adjusting accordingly. We can't just use the rubber stamp adjustment that of appraisers have used in the past. It's something that we always need to extract from the market, but they better be current and understand that people really want pools. You can't get a pool installed in, I think most of the pool companies are 2 years out right now. So things like that have made a big change. And then of course, with the ability to work from home, we're getting a huge increase of buyers from California, New York, all kinds of other states that are looking to come to a market like Atlanta. And to them, our prices are a steal. They're a very good deal. Taxes are low. So I think what it's doing is it's actually causing, you know, it's obviously causing values in Atlanta to rise at really an exponential rate. So all these things have kind of led us to the point where now you've pretty much got to be a cash buyer or removing a lot of contingencies to even get your bid accepted. So how does that play into the appraisal side? Well, it creates major appraisal issues because appraisals are based on precedent. We have to have closed sales, properties in the past that allow us to represent what's going on in the market. And as Brian said, appraisers don't determine market value, we interpret market value. So we look at what buyers and sellers have done in the past. This is how we can come up with our adjustments, and this is how we can appraise property. The problem is that if values are going up so quickly, it's virtually impossible for appraisers to keep up with it. And here's another anomaly that I've noticed recently that's causing another wrinkle to this whole equation. Historically in Atlanta, you've always written 30-day contracts. You might even push for a 3-week contract, but 30-day was always the norm. What we're seeing more common today is 60 to 90-day closings on these contracts. That's due to sellers not knowing where they're going. You know, a lot of things, you know, backups in the mortgage process and what have you. So what is that doing? It's holding my comparables hostage for an extra month or two, and I can't use them as a sale to justify the value that's out there right now. So you've seen in appraisals that appraisers include active and pending comps. You're probably wondering why is an appraiser using an active and pending comp? I thought you couldn't use an active. And in a sense, it's true. I can't put any weight on an active or a pending. But what the actives and more specifically the pendings tell us is the direction that the market's going. So we use those to help calculate our rate of appreciation. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. But those pendings can be used as a point of reference, but I can't use them as a closed sale until they actually close. So this is really critical. If you want to make sure your transactions go through and you've got a sale or you've got a property in your neighborhood that's currently under contract, you may have priced your property based on that. Buyers are looking at that as a comp, but it hasn't closed yet. If it's due to close in the next few days, the next week, you want to hold the appraiser off. Talk to your loan officer, tell Brian or whoever your loan officer is to hold off on the appraisal assignment and wait until that property closes, because we have what's called the effective date of appraisal, and that's the date at which we cross the threshold, the day we visit the property. That is the date that we value the property on. It doesn't matter what happens after that date. We can't include it in our appraisal. So it's very important. And all of my appraisers here at D.S. Murphy know to do this. We will look at the market. If there's a situation like that, we will go back to you and the lender and say, we would prefer that we wait an extra week or whatever the case may be. And maybe you need to adjust some of your contingencies in the contract, but it's a heck of a lot better than me coming in low and feeling awful because I can't get to your value because I can't use that comparable. So we're in a really difficult position right now because we've gone through a year of dramatic changes in marketability and market value. You know, I don't want to use a comp that sold before July. I mean, July is when the market really started to change and we saw very high rates of appreciation. Then as we crossed into the new year, the rates even steepened more. And as Brian alluded to earlier, most of the appraisals we're doing right now, we're adjusting 1% to 2% a month for appreciation. But that wasn't the case back in, you know, March, April, May, and June of last year. It was very flat. So you can't look at appreciation, you know, as a linear progression. You've got to look at it more closely as what is happening in the market right now. And I'm going to show you in a little bit how we go about making those calculations and adjustments. But very important, pending sales are going to be the key to your success in being able to manage the transaction, holding off the appraiser, whether that's catching it at the lender stage before it's ordered, or if you get a call from the appraiser, asking them to hold off and put it on hold, and that you're communicating this. They really need to hear it from the lender. So you've got to get to the lender as quickly as possible, and the lender will instruct the appraiser to put it on hold. So they're not going to want to do this. Most appraisers are going to give you pushback from that. They simply want to get in there, churn it out, and get on with the job. So be ready for that. But it's so important because we can't add a property that hasn't closed yet. So, you know, again, availability of data is so difficult. I was looking at an appraisal this morning, and unfortunately, nothing has sold in that subdivision since August. And there's been a huge change since August, but I've got to use some comparables in my subject neighborhood. Now, bear in mind, you've heard a lot of Fannie Mae guidelines. You've heard a lot of information about appraisals. How far can you go back? How far in distance can an appraiser go? All these things are guidelines, and they all mean well, but they're not rules. They're not hard, fast rules. I don't have to stay in my subject subdivision. If I'm trying to appraise the property and show what the market value is today, of course, I'm going to use something in my subdivision, but I'm going to use sales that a typical buyer would have considered in that market that have sold more recently. And that's exactly what you do with a buyer. When there are no sales in the neighborhood that they really want, you go and look in other substitute neighborhoods. So the sheer lack of comparables has caused us a lot of trouble and being able to verify the data. Another situation, as many of you know, is the way in which FMLS operates and the way in which they collect their fees. I'm very much aware of the 1% number that you all have to pay on both sides of the transaction. And there are a lot of agents who feel that they don't need to put a property into the multiple listing service if they were able to sell it quickly on their own before the need to put it in there. And that's not the case. If you have an exclusive right to sell listing, you are required to put it in there regardless of how quickly you sell it or what the circumstances are. And the reason I'm saying this is that I'm not the FMLS police. It's critical for me to have that information and that it be exposed to the market. Can I use a off-market sale, a pocket listing? Maybe, but how am I going to be able to verify the sales price? As Brian indicated early on in his presentation, most of these don't show up in the tax records for months, and no appraiser is going to go digging through the tax records looking for comps, because even if I find something that looks like a comp, how do I know it was an arm's length transaction? How do I know that there wasn't some, a relationship between the parties? How do I know the condition and the quality of the home without having some photos available? So all of these things are barriers to me for being able to use that as a comparable sale. So if you have properties in your neighborhood which sold off market, and there are many legitimate reasons for that, get as much data as you possibly can. If there was any way for you to have gotten inside the property while it was listed, maybe you showed it, it was a for sale by owner, or it was a property that was offered without an exclusive right to sell listing contract. If you've got some photographs, or even worst case, say this is your neighborhood, right? You sell everything or most everything in there. Approach the new homeowner and welcome them to the neighborhood and ask them to help others in the neighborhood increase the value by allowing you to come in and just take a couple brief photographs for other appraisers to use. That will make or break future appraisals. So having say a photograph of the master, the kitchen, a few rooms, front and back, as many photos as you can get would be phenomenal. If you've got a copy of the HUD or the closing statement, we could utilize that in the short term before it's published in the public records. And then just in the private remarks, attention appraisers and agents, I have detailed information on a property that's sold off market at such and such address. Please contact me. That will be critically important for you in being able to use those. So pocket listings, again, it's important to have as much data available to us as possible. Institutionally, from a lender standpoint, there's no rule whether we can or cannot use it. It's up to the appraiser to make sure that they're able to verify enough information that they can create a credible report. And is there enough information available to a subsequent appraiser, a review appraiser, or somebody else reviewing this report that they could find similar information? So that's why you want to publicize it and make it available. So again, everything you can do to make sure that everything makes it into the multiple listing service, even if it goes in with 0 days on market, throw a couple pictures in there. It's critically important to us. Not only because I need to use it as a comparable, but also because I need to use it in my analysis for appreciation. So we're going to get to that here in a minute. So yeah, the number one appraisal issue that I have when I'm looking at these low or bad appraisals is a lack of appreciation adjustment. And it was discussed a little bit earlier in the class. A lot of appraisers don't know how to make the appreciation adjustment, don't take the time to do it, and what have you, but it's critical. It's the most important adjustment right now in the market that we're in. And the appraiser needs to take the necessary time to calculate it and apply it properly. Another thing that a lot of appraisers don't understand is the way in which to apply the appreciation adjustment. In most transactions, well, in all transactions, the meeting of the minds was done at the time of contract. So what we're actually doing is adding an appreciation adjustment based on the date it went under contract, not the date it closed, compared to the date that we're doing our appraisal. And typically that's 30, 60, and as we're saying, as I said just earlier, sometimes maybe as many as 90 days on a typical transaction. But it's critically important when you're doing new or newer construction, when the property goes under contract, say back in July and doesn't close until January of the next year. They agreed on that purchase price back in July, and that's where the appreciation should start. So that's another problem that we see all the time. So listings, the number of listings, the number of properties available, typically we got about 1,500 in this market area that I've described. It's now dropped down to 500-600, very, very limited availability of properties available and availability for appraisers to use as comps. If we look at the median price and the days to sell, days on market have dropped to virtually zero. We see 2, 3, 4 days in there. That's virtually multiple offers on the first day that it was on the market. And then we're seeing the median sales price obviously significantly climb. If you look at the trough that was right here, just right before the beginning of the year compared to where it was in January, that's as much as a 10% increase right there. So we have to calculate these rates of appreciation. There is no website that we can go to. There is no list. The AJC doesn't publish a number that we use. We've got to go into our databases and come up with this number because it varies. You know, it varies by price point to price point. It varies by location to location. So it's something the appraiser needs to do every time and needs to, you know, go through the methodology to make sure that they get it right. So here's the closed median sales price. And you're seeing the same thing, a significant rise just here in the last 3 months since this market has started to take off. So how do we calculate appreciation? Where do appraisers get the data to do this? We get it from the same place you do, the multiple listing service, whether it's Georgia MLS or FMLS. There is a report down here that many of you have never seen before, but it's there. It is the way in which we calculate market conditions. That's what MC stands for. And the way in which we do it is we go into the multiple listing service. We put in our parameters that would result in the comparable properties that we're going to be looking at. And by putting in a 1 year time span, we're able to collect all that data. And by using this print function, it will print out a form that looks something like this. Fannie Mae is an interesting organization. They've got their pluses and minuses. This is the resulting document that appraisers look at. The question all of you will have to answer on today's test, so I'll tell you right up front, we're going to ask you how many quarters are in a year? Yes, 4. Why does Fannie Mae give us three columns? The official answer when I was on the podcast with Fannie Mae is they couldn't fit all these words in over here, so they consolidated the first 2 quarters into 1 column right here. Kind of ridiculous because it really makes a misleading situation when in 6 months, 13 properties sold, and then in 3 months, 11 sold and 23 sold. You really have to divide that by 2 to get a more representative number. So it really went from like 7, 7, 11, 23, clearly increasing by a significant amount. But this is the line that's most important down here is the median sales price. Now, I will tell you that this form, in addition to the number of columns, has a number of other setbacks or things that make it less reliable, and there's really nothing we can do about it. Number one is it takes median numbers, and we all know from elementary school, mean, median, and mode. You know, mean is the middle number, and so some outliers can significantly impact those median numbers. So it's critical that the appraiser look at the data that's put out and remove any significant outliers before they calculate this report. The other big significant difference is that these are unadjusted numbers. So the sales that were used to come up with these numbers are unadjusted. They are not taking into consideration any significant differences. Now, by the fact that they are comparable, they're able to be used in this analysis. But you know, let's say we've got 2 properties that are virtually identical, except one has an in-ground pool and another doesn't. So if we're talking in this particular price range, that pool could be worth $75,000. So if the one with the pool sold first and then the one without the pool sold later, they're still identical properties except for the pool, but it's going to look like values are declining because the lower sales price sold after the higher sales price. So that's something that an appraiser needs to identify, keep in mind when they're looking at this. You can't take these numbers 100% literally. You need to interpret the data properly. But the idea is that if the median home sales price was $856 a year ago, and now it's $925, you take the difference between those 2 and divide it into the 856, and you would arrive at a specific appreciation number. What is, I think, more indicative of the market is to look at quarter over quarter, because as I said earlier, the first 2 quarters of last year really don't show us the data that we need to know. We really need to know what's going on in the last 2 quarters, specifically the last quarter. So taking this number and subtracting this number and then dividing it out over a 6-month period is going to give you a slightly different number. So again, appreciation isn't linear. We want to look at what's really happening in today's market. We want to compare these numbers as I showed you. In the first calculation, that taking this over that gives us an 8% annualized appreciation. But if we look at quarter over quarter, it's 22% annualized appreciation, which is a lot more believable to me in this market where we are seeing between 1% and 2% appreciation. So you can see how much work goes into this, how much additional thought goes into this. I have to go back and regroup my comparables. I have to expand my parameters. There can be situations where we get very limited data. As I said earlier, there are very few sales available. There are very few active listings even available. So there are times when we've got to manipulate in an ethical way our parameters in order to get enough data to get any type of result that makes any sense. Fannie Mae's position on that is no, stay with a very tight range, a very tight area. And if there are a bunch of zeros and if the data doesn't make any sense, that's okay. Well, that's not good enough for me. I need to be able to see a trend. I need to be able to make accurate adjustments based on what's happening in the market. Now, remember, Brian showed you how an appraiser needs to make these physical boundaries that define a given neighborhood area. And we all know that a lot of times buyers are looking at school districts. So that could be one way to help an appraiser come in with the boundaries. We also look at physical boundaries. You wouldn't want to go from one side of the Chattahoochee to another necessarily. You wouldn't want to go from one county to another necessarily. So all of these things play into the way in which the appraiser develops that neighborhood area. Within that area, though, you've got multiple different price points. You may have homes in the 300,000s. You may have homes in the 800,000-900,000, and you might have multi-million homes. They're all reacting and changing at a different rate. So the appraiser has to use only comparable properties. So when I really dig into it and I see some appraisers doing appreciation but doing it wrong, they're not using comparable properties. They're using the $300,000 homes and the $2 million homes, and it's skewing all of this data and creating unreliable results. So Fannie Mae has actually discontinued the requirement to use this form. Most lenders still require it, and I still utilize it, but it's just one of the tools that I use in addition to some regression analysis and other things that the multiple listing service offers to kind of zero in on an appreciation rate. So again, some of the setbacks or errors in the 1004 MC that we use is that it's median values and it's unadjusted values. So this was just another good example. If values were at 450, then they dropped to 410, then they went to 422 and up to 445. It could simply be that pool that was in that property that sold early on in the year. And if that was taken out of that number, you would then see a very clear trend in appreciation. So these are things appraisers need to think about and analyze. Here's an example of a new construction property which demonstrates what I talked about a little bit earlier, in that if there's a significant difference in the under contract date and the sales date, it can have much bigger impact on the overall value. And so if a property went under contract back, 7-8 months prior, today, if it went back on the market, this property would be listed in the upper 8s. It'd be 880, 890, something like that. Same with these. And this one being significantly newer shows that we're up into that price point. So very important concept for appraisers to know and understand. There were some initial questions about adjustments, how appraisers make adjustments. So that's the way in which we approach the time adjustment. But another thing that I see a lot of appraisers not doing well enough is adjusting appropriately for lot size. You know, somebody might not really know the difference between 30,000 square feet and 21,000 square feet, or between 18,000 square feet and 21,000 square feet. But if it's a significant amount, the appraiser should be adjusting for that. So we want to look at overall lot size. And then there are other features that play into overall lot value that have to do with view amenities, positive and negative. If you're up against power lines, or if you're against a golf course. What we've also seen, and it's an article I'm working on right now, is the diminishment or elimination of what we call external obsolescence in times like we are in right now. And what I mean is, if you've got that property that's on a power line or has a huge ravine lot or some really negative thing, you might not be able to sell that in a normal market, or it might take you 6 months to a year to find that buyer that's interested in it. In today's market, where there is such a low supply of homes, that adjustment that we would make significantly drops almost to the point of zero. People almost won't care that they're on the power line just so that they can get a property. So it's very interesting. And again, why we don't want to hold on to these adjustments in our head. And people ask me all the time, what do you adjust for power lines? And there is no answer to that question. You've got to go in and extract it every time you're doing it. We may have some good background data from prior appraisals that we've done, but you've got to relook at it. So very important to keep yourself current and make sure that you're reflecting what the current market is actually saying about this and not what you believe in the past. So Brian had mentioned the difference between an appraiser's personal opinion and what the market is actually seeing. So I mentioned this earlier, but I'll go ahead and reiterate because it is so important, is it's critical for your success is to manage your pendings. So hold that appraisal off, make sure that that property closes, communicate with each other. I know in certain situations, particularly early on in your listing, as far as it being under contract, that you want to keep that information confidential, what you're under contract for. But I require all my appraisers to reach out to the listing agent, find out what they're under contract for, because we know that 90% or more of properties under contract right now are actually under contract at a number much higher than the list price. So we can't simply assume that it's 2 or 3% below list like we've done in the past. So that information is critical to us. So please find a way to share that with us. Generally, we're looking at pendings that are closer to the time of closing, and hopefully you're out of all your contingency periods. But also remember that an appraiser takes this information in confidence. We've got ethical responsibilities not to divulge this information to anyone other than our client. And so it will go into our appraisal report. Generally, what I'll do is I'll put your list price in there, and then I'll make an adjustment down below, which we call negotiation. And in this case, instead of it being a negative number, it would be a positive number. So if you need to talk to the appraiser in terms of percentages, yeah, we're 1% above list price or 2% above list price. Whatever you can do to help us out is going to help you out. So please try to share that information with appraising, because appraising is an art. It's not a science. There is a lot of science behind it, but the good appraisers are the ones that understand exactly which comparables to use and which not, how to make adjustments to those comparables, when to adjust, and then how to reconcile their appraisal. One of the most important processes or parts of the appraisal completion is at the very end to just sort of sit back and look at the numbers. Do they make sense to you? Why is one adjusting much higher than another? Go back and look at it. And this is where we can develop changes in the adjustments that we use. So I'm typically been using $65 a square foot. It looks to me, if I raise it to 70, it brings this one down and this one up, and we have a very tight range. I always say when I teach my classes to pull out an appraisal that you've had done on one of your properties, your home property or a property that you've had listed in the past, and go to the grid section where we have all of the comparables, and there may be multiple pages. There should be actually multiple pages. Find the very bottom number on that grid, which is what we call our adjusted sales price, and put it in order and then put it into a sentence. This appraiser says this house is worth between X and Y. So if you've got a property that's under contract for 500,000 and he says this property is worth between 387 and 602, that's not a very convincing statement. The appraiser hasn't completed the report, in my opinion. He hasn't done the proper reconciliation. He's either using wrong comparables or not making appropriate adjustments. And so myself and all of the team leaders here at D.S. Murphy, we really ride our appraisers very hard on having a very tight range. There is no one number any property is worth. There's always going to be a 2, 3, 4% range of those adjusted numbers. But if you're selling at 500,000, it should be something in the very high upper fours and something in the very low 500s to what that range should be. And there is no formula, there is no rule as to how the appraiser arrives at that final number. I wish that we could just put a range in the report and send it back to the lender. But like what Brian said, they've got to have a number so they can calculate LTV. So it's at that point and that point only that I look at the contract. So the contract has been supplied to the appraiser. The appraisers to review the contract, make sure that it represents an arm's length transaction, or if it doesn't, to comment on that. And then at that point, you know, we really take that contract and kind of put it on a pedestal. This is what the market's telling us. And particularly if you've had multiple offers, and it's very important. One other thing I'll add to the list of things you want to give to appraisers when they come out is give them those multiple offers. You don't have to give them the whole contract. Either give them the first page or type it up on a sheet, something that they can have, that they can put in their appraisal report that will demonstrate to a reader that might be up in Minneapolis or wherever, what's going on in this Atlanta market. And this is what happened. We put it on the market for this, and we've got these 15 offers, and that's very compelling. And again, my job is not to determine market value, let the market speak. So we will then look to that contract, and if there's any way that we can justify that value, we will. We often get criticized as appraisers because we often come in at the purchase price, right? What good are we anyways? Anyone can do that. The issue is more that I've done everything I can to get up to your purchase price, and the appraisal is a bit of a lagging indicator. As I said, I can't use those pendings until they close, but they're really having a big impact on the current market. And I can't really fully take that into consideration. Even with the most aggressive appreciation adjustment, I can't make it to those numbers sometimes. So there is a challenge. It is difficult. You know, D.S. Murphy is coming in low on some purchases. I can't say that we make every deal work. There are some deals that maybe shouldn't work, or there's just certain situations where we just simply can't justify that number yet with the data that we have. But what we will do is, and this is something that Prosperity believes in too, is we will contact both agents before we complete this report and make sure that we've got all the data that's possibly available. When we come out to do an appraisal for you, we will welcome that package. We'll even welcome that bottle of wine. But you know, anything that you can give us to help us with the process is critical information and should be welcomed, because we should work with you, not against you. And those appraisers that come out and give you the stiff arm and say they're not allowed to talk to you, that's an indication that they're not a very professional appraiser, and it's somewhat of an indication of their competency. So we will take all that information, prepare as much information as possible, and then follow the steps that Brian gave you in helping the appraiser any way that you can. So all of that is critical to getting this to go through. So if we're coming in low, we'll come back and allow you to give us that information up front. Now, people ask a lot about VA appraisals. Can you fight a VA appraisal? We don't do VA appraisals. I've tried to get on the list for quite a while, but I don't think any of the appraisers in my area have died yet. I know that sounds horrible, I'm sorry, but most of them are as old as dirt. And unfortunately, they're stuck in their ways and they don't seem to appraise to the same standards as the rest of the appraisers do. And no offense to some of the appraisers that do VA that I know that do a good job, but many of them have told me stories of how when they started with VA, they were putting in 5, 6, 7, 8 comparables. VA said, no, 3 only. And there's just so many things that VA does that causes it to be a lot more conservative than a typical appraiser. appraisal. However, they are still held to the same laws and rules. We have ethical rules, USPAP, and we have state rules. So they're still held to the same licensing standards as everybody else. So they don't get a free pass there. So can you fight a VA appraisal? Certainly. But what VA does is they put the rebuttal process in front of the completion as well. They call it tidewater. So if you've ever heard that word used in relationship to VA appraisals, what they're doing is the VA appraiser is required to go out and inspect the property and work up his report to a point that he has determined that the value is not going to meet the sales price, at which point he is to put the appraisal on hold and then notify all parties involved through the processor that they need to supply additional information to help the appraiser. The problem with this process is that you don't know what he's got. You don't have an appraisal in front of you that he's completed that you can review and critique. You are simply flying blind. So it creates a challenge, but what you want to do is make sure that you react during that period and supply as much information as you possibly can. Now, most likely, you've already given him everything that you have if you met him at the property and have followed our procedures. But that's how VA handles it, so that once he does move forward with the appraisal and completes it, it is a lot more difficult to get that rebuttal through the VA process because he has completed it already. So make sure you don't miss your opportunity, at least, to give him as much information as possible. The biggest challenge with any rebuttal is comparables. Every lender has their own rebuttal process, but they're all very much the same. Some of them have a form, some of them don't. What they want is more comps. Give me more comps, more recent comps, closer comps. Well, the appraiser probably used all of the most recent comps and all of the closest comps. He just didn't adjust them properly. So there's still nothing wrong with critiquing the comparables that the appraiser used. If there are other additional comparables, certainly supply those. But the challenge that we find dealing with most rebuttals is it's an argument between appraisers. One says the adjustment should be this, the other says the adjustment should be that. Those are very difficult to win. That's why we want to make sure we get our appraisals right before we turn it in, because the underwriter tends to lock in on the appraisal that's been submitted, and that anyone trying to supply information after the fact is biased, and it creates more of a challenge. But the rebuttal process is there and you can utilize it. In today's market, with the way values are going, you really want to be making sure that, if at all possible, to eliminate the appraisal contingency. I know you probably say, yeah, I did that, and the appraisal came in so low that the borrower was not able to move forward with the financing contingency. They didn't have enough cash to bridge the enormous gap. So that's the challenge that we have to deal with. So what we try to do is help in rebuttal situations, try to help you get that value up as high as possible to justify and hopefully get that buyer to be able to get the loan that they need to close on it. But most buyers that, any buyer that's putting in a contract right now with no appraisal contingency better be prepared to have a significant amount of cash to bridge the gap. And you need to be careful and watchful of that when you're taking your offers in and reviewing your contracts. And it also goes back to which lender is that buyer using. And that's part of our consultation services. I will be there when you're ready to review those 15 contracts, and I'll give you my 2 cents from an appraisal standpoint. Obviously, we've already talked about Quicken Home Loans, but there are a lot of lenders that I know right off the top of my head where you may very well have an appraisal issue. So be watchful of that. But I can't stress enough, and I'm not just saying this because it's a prosperity presentation. You could catch me at any one of my classes and I'll list them as really the best one from an appraisal standpoint, because you've got Brian and other appraisers on staff that understand the market. They're not trying to be conservative. They just want to let the market reflect what's going on. And, right now with so few, very few appraisal contingencies, we're actually getting to see the market react in the way that it wants to. And appraisers are having very little impact on values, which is the way it should be. An appraiser should never have an impact on market value. Our job, again, is to interpret what's going on in the market and do the very best we can to justify those values. So we've got a few minutes left for any questions. Kate, do you have any questions in the queue?
Thank you, Scott. That's great information. You know, it's so powerful to be able to have his perspective on the local market, and you know, he runs a very big firm. You know, in our opinion, one of the best in the Atlanta area. Although they certainly cover many more states than Georgia. It's great to get that perspective, especially in such a difficult market. And like Scott was saying, you know, appraisers, you know, they're doing the best they can on the day that they are inside the inspection. They're not making a forecast of value. So a lot of times, you know, people say, well, you know, appraisers, you know, they're, you know, something that they aren't. You know, if 6 months from now, the whole housing market falls apart, you know, that's 6 months from now, not today. It's very challenging when you've got, you know, 10 people who want to buy a property and they're paying $1 million more than the list price. That's a pretty good indication. It's a little bit like Tesla stock. Sometimes Tesla stock is worth a lot and sometimes it's worth a lot less. There is no forecast. No one knows. A little bit like Bitcoin. You know, Bitcoin had a bad weekend. Markets, they go up, they go down. Real estate definitely has a lot more sort of frictional elements to it. So right, there's slower moving up and down, you hope, but the price is moving all the time. And appraisers just have to be able to do the best they can on the day that they do the inspection. They're not making a forecast and they're certainly not looking in the past.
Thanks, Brian. Maple, do we have any questions, or Kate?
Oh, this is the open mic portion of our class today. We're, you know, coming up on 3 hours. Thanks everybody. This is sort of there's a lot of people who run marathons in less time than 3 hours. So we know that this is kind of like a stamina thing. They never do a Zoom call more than an hour because everybody's basically, you know, dragging through it. We have done an awesome job this morning of trying to get everybody's CE together for 3 hours because we all needed to keep our certifications up to date. But we'll do the any topic, any issue for the last couple of minutes here. Dig into your bag of you always wanted to know. You've got a lot of appraisers on the call or on the CE class today. So I think we have a lot of different perspectives. If people want to ask questions, you can always, like I said, hit your space bar to unmute yourself and we'll take it from there.
Hey there, this is Mary for Scott. Addressing a question I asked earlier, in the Atlanta, particularly Buckhead market, how does floor level impact the appraisal in a high-rise condo?
It does. And, you know, you've got to look at it in the same thing. We want to find other comparables that have sold on that same floor or on similar floors to be able to extract that adjustment. Generally, what we see is properties under floor 7, floors 1 through 6, have similar impacts on value because that's typically the height of most medium buildings, mid-range buildings. Then when you get above 7, it makes a difference there. We want to have properties. A lot of these buildings are stacked, and what that means is it's the same unit on each floor so that you've got similar square footage, similar room count. So it's pretty easy to look at, say, what's on floor 12 as opposed to what's on floor 20. And if they're the same unit, you can extract out what that buyer is paying in floor location. But as a rough, again, I don't like to give out rough numbers, but you're talking a couple thousand to maybe 5,000 a floor for those types of differences. But make sure you're very careful if there's any specific view influences that you look at that separately. We have a great class called Appraiser's Guide to CMAs, and some of you may have taken it or you may have heard of it. You may have heard D.S. Murphy gives out a list of adjustments. Well, from an educational standpoint, we put together a list of example adjustments, and it's they vary based on location, and then they also vary based on price point. So a bathroom in a $300,000 home might be worth $5,000, and a bathroom in a $1 million home might be worth $20,000. So we give you some example adjustments to illustrate those types of things. So if you're interested in that, watch for that class in particular. Maple's got this up on the screen now, so if any of you need to leave, you can go ahead and follow the similar procedure as you did checking in and using today's code for checkout. But Brian and I will stay on for more questions.
Do be careful. You know, it is so easy to think of like a rule of thumb. Boy, if I just knew this thing, you know, always a garage is worth X number of dollars. And the market simply does not work that way. And this can really be a little bit like a broken clock, which means you can be right twice a day and wrong the rest of the time. And so just know that a garage in New York City could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a garage in a suburban or rural market, you know, may have slightly additive values to its cost. And so it always depends on the market. And unless you really do some investigation to that, these big amenities and features, it's easy to get that wrong. I do see appraisers all over the country really struggling with, you know, renovations and additions to properties, which is why I say, please give them some context on what was done, when it was done, and what was spent. Because if you've done a $500,000 kitchen, if the appraiser knows that that kitchen costs $500,000, they can think about that a little bit more strategically than if it's a $50,000 kitchen. In a marketplace multi-million-dollar home that requires this type of you know, amenity to help sell that home, you're potentially going to make all that you spent and then some back as a return on investment in that kitchen. And obviously in some markets you wouldn't. And so you're helping the appraiser think about that like they really should be doing by kind of giving them the context for it. We're open to any questions, any topic.
I have a question. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, sure, Ben.
Hey, I was just curious, for a consultation appraisal, is that something that takes 2 weeks, kind of the same time frame, I would guess, as a regular appraisal? I'm just thinking of my particular situation.
Yeah, budget for that, Matt. We're running about 10 to 14 days on those. We try to slight them in a little bit quicker, but yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Scott, you got anything to add, brick versus stucco?
Yeah, you want to be careful and make sure you determine whether it's, you know, EIFS or synthetic stucco. But what we're finding in a lot of high-end multi-million-dollar homes, the stucco homes are selling about the same as a brick home, because it becomes a matter of more of the interior quality features rather than the exterior. So if you've got hard coat stucco and stone, as opposed to a brick and stone home, they're very similar, no significant adjustments. And you're lower priced, it makes more difference. And we just try to extract what a buyer is willing to pay for that. Brick generally takes precedent over stucco, and then that over a siding home.
I think, and Scott mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth emphasizing. Inventory is really compressed right now. And so people are very aggressively bidding for the supply that's out there. And so elements that historically would have made a significant impact, like busy road or power lines or the type of stucco or brick, you might have seen these things show a big difference in the market 2 years ago. They're showing less of an impact now, because guess what? You have to buy what's there. So if you got 6 people trying to buy a house, the fact that it's brick or stucco may not be as important as it's available. And just know that that means that it's tough on appraisers, because they know that traditionally there might be a negative adjustment present in the marketplace for a busy street location, but that would be as if you could buy a house on a cul-de-sac. So if there are no other homes to buy, and that's just the house that you have to buy because it's the only one available, this busy street location might have been dissipated by the current demand in the marketplace. And so appraisers, they have to keep rethinking all these things all the time, like, amenities, construction elements, all those things are really changing day to day. It is really that dynamic.
And you also have to keep in mind there's a changing buyer profile now. If people coming from heavily urbanized California or New York areas, they're not as concerned with some of those other things. So it's not just your typical person living in Georgia.
And we see this, right? So COVID has been a big thing. It's making basically all the white collar workers work remote. So a lot of companies have said, you know what, we're going to stay remote forever. So you know what's awesome? I live in California. I pay 12% income tax for the state, but I'm going to move to Texas because you know what? There's no income tax. If you make $200,000 a year, you know how you can write yourself a $40,000 pay increase, you know, move to Tennessee, right? So you see people now moving from, you know, all these major metropolitan areas into all of these really diverse marketplace and having this huge disruptive impact. Because guess what? They're selling their house in California for millions of dollars and moving to Austin, Texas. And you know what? Now they've got this buying power, the likes of which that local market has never seen. However, also know that now that, you know, vaccines are out there, they say that starting today, everybody in the country who wants a vaccine can get a vaccine. You hope that everybody gets their vaccine, we get to herd immunity, and offices start opening back up. And one of the things that they might find is that remote work seemed like a really good idea at the time, but now they want everyone back in the office. And guess what? This whole large noise of people moving from San Francisco to Austin was great when it was great until it starts to reverse. And so there is no forecast for where property values will be in the future. You should also know that because of COVID, the 10-year treasury got down to basically 35 basis points. It is now trading today at 150 basis points. And you should know that 30-year money is almost always 150 to 200 basis points over the 10-year treasury. And for every 100 basis point movement in rates, you have an 11% increase or decrease in buying power. Think about this for a minute. So when interest rates went from 4% to 3% to 2.5%, that means that people could buy 20 to 25% more house. It's great when it works to your advantage. It is also terrifying when it works against you. And so as interest rates are now moving up, and guess what? No one can forecast where interest rates will be, but we're seeing all these big programs through the government, which are inflationary in nature. And obviously, as inflation starts to rear its ugly head, rates tend to go up. That means that buying power is potentially going the other way. The other thing to be aware of is that there are roughly 3 million people in the country right now who are not paying their mortgage. This is called forbearance. If you are in forbearance, you know the one thing you're not doing? You're not selling your house. This contributes to a lack of inventory. And this lack of inventory is a big part of what is going on in the marketplace. So there are a number of factors that could change in the near term that would potentially have a negative impact on real estate. So just because home prices go up doesn't necessarily mean that they don't go down. And so as people are buying real estate, they should always be taking a look at their own, you know, personal situation, what their long-term, you know, what are you hoping to get out of this and why does it matter to me? It can't be more important than today. And I see people, and there's 100 people bidding on a house and they're all doing these multiple bids and are reiterating, you know, do anything I can to win. There comes a point when you have to decide whether or not winning at all cost is the right decision for you personally and for you, the people that you are advising on real estate. You know, you need to have Bitcoin, but maybe you don't need Bitcoin at 65,000 because it's trading at 55 today, right? So just know markets are always moving. I know that this is America and we always have to have everything now, but sometimes, you know, maybe if it's not the right choice, there's a price cost benefit equation that you have to run through, and just know that that's a part of the equation today as well.
I have one more question. This is Matt. Since a lot of people are encountering multiple offer situations these days and with prices sometimes being above asking, I just was curious again, if you could walk me through the questions, critical questions for us to ask. I know that you mentioned vetting the lender, and it sounded like that there was an opportunity for the appraiser to call you and you to check how many miles the appraiser is driving from. I just want to make sure I understand how to implement that.
Yeah, I think it is super important to vet the lender because not all lenders are created equal. I mean, some lenders, you know, they've spent billions of dollars to make sure that they have the right operational staff to perform, you know, loans in a timely fashion in today's market. And some of them have not kept up with that. And therefore it's like you give them a loan application and they close it, you know, 8 weeks later. And that's not great if you're trying to buy the house in 3 weeks, right? So not all lenders are created equal and you should sort of know the difference. And if you're not doing enough transactions, you've got great peers inside of almost all of your offices. So have a conversation with them. They'll all know. Trust me. If they're a horrible lender, it doesn't take too long for people to know that. But you can also vet all the lenders for their appraisal process. And you should know whether or not they're using local appraisers who are high quality, whether they're paying the appraisers decently in a competitive fee, and whether they have a dispute process. Those three elements, you should know that upfront. Because if you don't know those things up front, then you're just rolling the dice. I mean, if a terrible appraiser shows up and you didn't get a promise that that wouldn't happen, then what are you going to do? What if the lender doesn't have a dispute process? Then what are you going to, it's like you're stuck. Don't get stuck behind the Powerball, you know, advocate for yourself. So am I going to see a dispute appraisal process? What is it going to look like? Is the appraiser going to be local? Yes or no? What do you mean by that? And are they going to get the full fee, or are you going to like chart, you know, pay them $100 and collect the other $600 for yourself? And so by knowing that up front, when the appraiser does call to set the appointment, you can, you know, you can sort of test whether you're getting what you were promised. And if not, don't yell and scream at the appraiser because it's not their fault. Just say, hey, I'll call you back. Call the lender and say, you know, you promised me these things. I'm not seeing it. Can you fix it? Because you should know the lenders that use appraisal management companies, they often don't get what they pay for, right? So the appraisal management company's out there, you know, running amok, and the lender doesn't even know that. And they don't know it unless you let them know it. And when you do, you hope that the great, you know, a good lender will get it fixed for you. That's the time, that's the best skillful complaining I've ever seen is, you know, it's not the appraiser's fault that he's getting paid $100. I mean, he's got kids to pay, right? Or feed or whatever, go to college. If they promised you something, that's up to the lender, make them perform.
And on the listing side, you often, you know, don't have quite as much control in vetting the situation. What does your contract say? Does your contract prohibit bifurcated appraisals? This is something that Quicken Home Loans has been doing for quite some time, where they send a guy out with a Jimmy John sign on the top of his car to measure your house and take all the pictures. He sends it back to another guy sitting at his computer on the other side of the state who doesn't know your market at all, and he writes up the appraisal. That's perfectly legitimate, and Fannie Mae was the one that actually instituted the program. Or will you say in your contract that you won't accept a desktop or drive-by appraisal? Those are the two COVID alternatives right now. And at D.S. Murphy, we won't do those unless there's a specific medical situation or whatever. We'll of course work around that, but we want to get in the property. We want to do a full appraisal, and we're not going to take the easy out of doing it as a desktop or a drive-by unless we absolutely have to.
And there's a question is can you have them list the lender's, the buyer's lender? Of course you can, right? If you got multiple offers, you basically can do anything you want. You're going to advise the seller like, hey, we got 29 offers. Here are the top 6 that I think you should consider. And part of it can be the lenders that they're using, because we know all lenders are not created equal. So absolutely, you know, if you, like I said, if it's been 500 days, you haven't sold a property and someone writes an offer, you got to take what you got, right? But if you got 20, 30, 40, 50 offers, then you're in the driver's seat. You can stack them any way you want. And should.
Thank you all very much.
All right, wrap it up.
I just have one quick question. You brought up the desktop appraisal, that was kind of a short-term solution right now due to COVID. But I've heard in the market, even from some of our agents, right, that when a desktop appraisal is used, that increases the likelihood, right, of the appraisal essentially being waived. So can you talk through that? I mean, is there kind of certain criteria? Is that desktop appraisal only being used when there is an underlying health condition, or is it also taken into consideration like the location of the property, the type of the property, if there's a lot of comps to choose from that the appraiser can quickly look at?
Yeah, so it's a great question. You should know that property inspection waivers, appraisal waivers, this is nothing to do with the type of appraisal. So like a desktop, a drive-by, a full appraisal, that's when an appraisal is required. But when you run DU, LP, all of the sort of underwriting engines for the lender, often what the investor will come back with based on their own internal information they have on that property, based on the collateral risk elements that investor sees. And Fannie and Freddie both have these vastly complicated and sophisticated collateral engines that they've built over the last 10, 15 years that allow them to get an automated value model. So they already know what the property is worth from a value standpoint. And often they've already got condition characteristics on that property because they already own the loan. And so in that situation, based on just the collateral elements, not the credit elements, and this is what gets very confusing for people, they're running DU, LP for the collateral elements, not the credit elements. So just because you have a 50% LTV purchase transaction does not mean you will get an appraisal waiver, because they may know nothing about that house. So they're not underwriting the credit to give you an appraisal waiver. They're underwriting the collateral. So if they got a lot of information on the home, its condition, and its value, then potentially they'll waive the appraisal requirement. And you'll see that right up front once the underwriting engine runs. So the lender will know that as soon as they underwrite the loan, they'll know if they've got an appraisal waiver. Now, these desktop appraisals and drive-by appraisals and full appraisals, that's once an appraisal is required. In today's world, the investors are giving some flexibilities to the lenders because they know that a lot of people don't want someone. There have been appraisers nationally who've died of COVID. And so this is, it's a very serious disease. We now got, 600,000 dead people in the United States, more than all of the wars ever fought in the United States. And so from that standpoint, it's a dangerous virus and people want to be safe. And the investors recognize that they still want to do lending into this space. And so they made these appraisal alternatives available in the first mortgage space, but that's really sort of separate from an appraisal waiver.
Okay, got it.
Appraisal waivers are with us and they're with us to stay. I actually think some of these appraisal flexibilities are with us and with us to stay as well. So I think that as we move forward past COVID, we are going to find that desktop appraisals and drive-by appraisals and appraisal hybrids and things like that, they're not going anywhere. They're definitely still going to be tools that are used in the mortgage space. And in fact, probably will be continuing to expand over time. We are certainly seeing the use of property inspection waivers at a significant level, and there's no reason to believe that that won't do anything but expand over time as well.
Got it. There's one question in the chat that kind of ties into the question that I asked. It says, do you recommend we put in a special step stating no drive-by or desktop appraisals?
If you're working with Prosperity Home Mortgage, like Scott was saying, we're doing purchase transactions, and because we're doing purchase transactions, we recognize that we want the best type of appraisal we can. And therefore, we do everything we can to get a full appraisal. But yeah, sure, you could certainly let your lender know that, hey, you're very concerned, this thing sold $250,000 over list price. You don't want to skip on the appraisal product and have an appraisal problem. But I think any lender worth their salt isn't going to rely on one of these alternative appraisal products and then create an appraisal problem that they can't solve because they didn't inspect the property. So, at Prosperity, our default is to get a full-blown appraisal because we're always doing purchase transactions. But if we got a desktop appraisal and we had a problem with the valuation, i.e. matching the purchase price, we would always immediately escalate it to a different type of appraisal product to solve that problem. We're not just going to say, hey, we got this terrible appraisal and man, it's really bad for you because, it's not going to work out. And hey, that's the way it goes. I hope you can buy another house. That's just not, most lenders aren't going to work that way. And certainly Prosperity Home Mortgage would not. I know that attention is the big premium in today's world. Appreciate you guys spending 3 hours with us on this call in CE. Maple and Kate, thank you so much for making this happen. It doesn't happen without you. Scott, as always, I learned something. So I appreciate you coming in and making it not a full marathon for me. And I think with that, we'll take our leave and go on to bigger and better things today. So thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Very good. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks so much.